Welcome back to Historical Sleep, the storyteller for your sleep partner that digs up the history beneath our feet. If you love stories about small towns with big secrets, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode and can follow Alara's journey in real time. Drop us a comment below or reply to this episode on our story and let us know where you are right now. Seeing our audience map grow is one of the best parts of making this show. Your input keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1: The Fading Maps, Unearthing the First Secrets. Dr. Elias Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, but he certainly believed in scars. A historical geographer by trade, Elias spent his life hunting for the architectural wounds of the United States, the places where ambition had met the bedrock and been violently thwarted. He specialized in the negative space of history, the dams that were never finished, the roads that abruptly ended, the towns that were bulldozed but never rebuilt. For a U.S. audience obsessed with progress and expansion, these forgotten failures were often more revealing than the celebrated successes. He was deep inside the bowels of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, a labyrinth of climate-controlled rooms that smelled perpetually of old linen and acidic paper, when he found the first anomaly. He wasn't looking for infrastructure. He was reviewing mid-century agricultural policy related to irrigation rights in the upper Midwest. The papers were dry, but Elias was meticulous, driven by the knowledge that the most explosive secrets are often tucked away in the most boring folders. The folder was labeled Project Sun Up, Supplemental Correspondence, 1909 to 1913. Inside, beneath endless sheaves of stamped mundane letters concerning water quotas, lay a sheet of oiled parchment, folded 4 ways and tied with a piece of brittle, faded silk ribbon. It was not agricultural. It was engineering. Elias carefully laid the parchment flat. It was huge, nearly 5 feet long, and stunningly rendered in India ink and vibrant, deep watercolor washes. The central legend, hand-drawn in a regal copperplate script, declared it to be the Great Northern Waterway, a plan for commercial arterial flow linking Lake Michigan to the Missouri River headwaters. Elias felt the familiar, exhilarating cold sensation of a genuine discovery. This wasn't just a plan, it was a revolution. The map proposed a massive canal and lock system, not just an extension of existing rivers, but the wholesale creation of a navigable 700-mile channel designed to divert and connect major watersheds across 4 states: Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. It would have effectively created an inland port system that bypassed Chicago and New Orleans entirely, connecting the industrial heartland directly to the nascent agricultural boom in the West. It was, in short, a geological rewriting of the American landscape. He traced the route with his finger. The scale was dizzying. Rivers were straightened, whole forests were marked for clearing, and, most chillingly, a series of 10 massive hand-drawn locks, each denoted by a geometric symbol labeled Type 4 reinforced concrete, were precisely marked along the proposed route. These locks were the size of small stadiums, designed to handle the largest Great Lakes freighters of the era. The map bore the signature of one Silas K. Vanderbilt, a name Elias dimly recognized as a minor but aggressive financier from the Panic of 1907, and was dated November 12, 1912. The official seal was an impressive, yet utterly unfamiliar, stylized eagle clutching 2 intertwined rivers, not the official seal of the Army Corps of Engineers, nor any state government. This was the blueprint of a private empire, designed to reshape America for profit. The sheer scale of the vision explained why it had faded, Elias thought initially. It was too big, too ambitious, a typical Gilded Age megalomaniacal dream. But as he began cross-referencing the project, the simple explanation dissolved into something darker. He spent the next 3 days in the archives, moving from agricultural reports to the records of the U.S. Department of Commerce. He searched for Great Northern Waterway, Vanderbilt Canal, and Silas K. Vanderbilt. Nothing. He expanded his search to contemporary engineering journals and legislative drafts from 1910 to 1914. Again, a baffling void. A project of this magnitude, requiring billions of dollars, thousands of laborers, and an act of Congress to permit the necessary land acquisition and environmental modification, should have left a paper trail a mile wide. The only things he found were strange, disconnected fragments. An editorial in a small-town Wisconsin newspaper from 1913 lamented the sudden cessation of survey work near the town of Port Hope, followed a week later by a full-page retraction that denied any such work had ever taken place. A congressional spending bill draft from 1911 contained an amendment entirely redacted save for the title Inland Commercial Artery, which was crossed out and replaced with appropriations for the maintenance of existing coastal fortifications. The entire discussion of the waterway had been scrubbed clean. It wasn't that the map was a failed dream. It was that the map was a suppressed history. The key break came in a collection of personal papers belonging to Senator Thaddeus J. Calhoun, a notoriously corrupt but powerful figure from the era. Calhoun's archive contained a single, crumpled letter, unsigned and undated, but written on the letterhead of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. The message was terse and chilling. The North Channel Project is a threat to the rail monopoly. SKV must be neutralized. All paper documentation to be absorbed by existing military requisitions by Q4 1913. The reason for the fading maps became brutally clear. Corporate warfare. The railroad barons, the undisputed rulers of American transportation at the time, had not merely opposed the Great Northern Waterway, they had systematically dismantled it, politically, financially, and archivally. They had employed Senator Calhoun to bury the plans, redirect the funding, and ensure every trace of the project was filed away under a misleading title, or, more effectively, under a completely separate government department.
Destroyed. The military requisitions were the perfect burial ground for a civilian project, a black hole of bureaucracy few historians would ever bother to look into. The oil parchment map, Elias realized, was not just a blueprint, it was a surviving casualty of America's first great infrastructure turf war, a secret victory for the railroads that secured their dominance for another 50 years. But Elias was a geographer, not just an historian. He knew that while politicians could shred paper, they couldn't shred reinforced concrete. If the project was serious enough to provoke a congressional-level cover-up by the nation's most powerful corporations, it must have broken ground. The letter had mentioned survey work near Port Hope, the tiny Wisconsin town Elias had seen mentioned in the retracted newspaper article. Elias left the quiet solitude of the archives and flew to Milwaukee, renting a beat-up pickup truck for the drive inland. Port Hope, Wisconsin, was now barely more than a crossroads, dominated by a faded grain silo and a gas station that sold stale coffee. It was the kind of place history had passed by twice. He located the area designated on Vanderbilt's map as Lock 5, Primary Waterway Elevation Lift. It was now a tangled wetland bordering a small, forgotten nature preserve. The air was thick with humidity and the drone of late summer insects. Pushing through dense thickets of cattails and overgrown brush, Elias followed the faint, unnatural straightness of an old survey line that cut through the woods, a line too straight for nature, too shallow for a road. Then he saw it. At the edge of the wetlands, partially submerged and choked by decades of root growth, stood a wall of gray stone. It wasn't granite or natural rock, it was concrete, but not the smooth, modern concrete of today. It was pre-1920s concrete, rough aggregate mixed with crushed stone, stained dark green and black by a century of damp earth. The wall was immense, 40 feet tall and nearly 100 feet wide, running straight for perhaps 50 yards before disappearing back into the swamp. It formed an unmistakable vertical buttress, far too large and structurally robust for any barn foundation or bridge abutment in this tiny, forgotten corner of the country. Elias scrambled down the slight embankment and placed his hand against the cold, damp surface. He was touching the outer shell of Vanderbilt's Type 4 reinforced concrete. This was the base of Lock 5, designed to lift a massive freighter nearly 60 feet. It was a concrete scar, hidden in plain sight, a monument to the ghost project that should have made Port Hope a bustling center of commerce, instead of an agricultural footnote. He knelt, pulling a trowel from his pack, and began scraping moss from the base. Just above the waterline, carved deep into the concrete by a long-ago mason, were 3 letters, G-N-W, the initials of the Great Northern Waterway, waiting a century for someone to find them. Elias stood back, looking at the monolithic wall of concrete that had been built to last 1,000 years, only to be buried and forgotten in 50. He realized the terrifying truth that the fading maps weren't just in the archives. They were everywhere, etched into the land itself, lying beneath the modern interstate, submerged under a quiet reservoir, or standing sentinel in the overgrown wilderness. America wasn't just built on foundations, it was built over secrets. And this, he knew, was only the first secret he would uncover on the ghost roads. The journey had just begun.
Chapter 2. Manifest Destiny's Iron Spine. The Unsung Railroad Builders. If the Great Northern Waterway was a blueprint buried by corporate fear, the Transcontinental Railroad was a success story built on corporate brutality. It was the physical manifestation of America's ambition, the iron spine that stitched the continent together, fulfilling the prophecy of manifest destiny in steel and steam. Yet, if you peel back the romance of the Golden Spike, you find not a triumphant monument, but a structure held together by the blood, sweat, and forgotten sacrifice of its builders. Dr. Elias Thorne, having documented the concrete scar of Lock 5 in the Wisconsin wetlands, turned his gaze westward. He traded the quiet, acidic decay of the archives for the deafening ghosts of the mountain passes. The forgotten railroad secrets, he knew, weren't buried deep underground. They were etched into the high slopes, the sheer rock faces, and the skeletal remnants of trestles that spanned impossibly deep ravines. The construction of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines was a race fueled by greed. Congress had provided immense land grants and generous subsidies, paying the companies by the mile. The faster they laid track, the richer they became. This was the engine of the railroad boom, not the promise of connection, but the raw, unadulterated pursuit of wealth. This intense financial pressure created an environment where speed was everything, and safety, humanity, and historical accuracy were disposable. The result was a workforce treated not as men, but as tools. The grinding gears of the Union Pacific. The Union Pacific, pushing west from Omaha, Nebraska, relied heavily on Irish immigrants, veterans of the Civil War, men displaced by famine, and roughnecks known collectively as the Paddy Boys. Their labor was cheap, fierce, and deadly. They worked in crews of 1,000 or more, sleeping in rough, mobile camps that became infamous as Hell on Wheels. The work itself was brutal. In the desolate landscape of Wyoming and Utah, temperatures swung wildly. Men were tasked with driving spikes into hard, unforgiving ground, often hauling 500-pound iron rails by hand. The hazards weren't just physical, they were cultural. With every mile gained, the crews encroached on territory fiercely defended by the Cheyenne and Sioux. Elias, studying old UP company records filed in Nebraska historical societies, found ledger after ledger marked simply casualty, Indian action, or accident, dynamite. The official casualty count of the railroad construction is famously low, hundreds.
But Elias's deep dive into local cemetery plots, county coroner reports, and unpublished workers' diaries suggested a toll closer to 5 times that number. Many were buried quickly in shallow graves near the tracks they died building, their names and families dissolving into the vastness of the prairie. The records also revealed a systematic practice of incentivizing labor through controlled access to alcohol and gambling in the Hell on Wheels towns. These temporary settlements, like Benton, Wyoming, which boasted 3,000 residents and 20 saloons but no permanent church or school, were infrastructure ghosts in human form. They existed solely to service the rail gang, moving on every few months, leaving behind nothing but scattered whiskey bottles, faint foundations, and a terrible reputation. The Irish laborer was essential, yet utterly expendable. He was the brute force needed to tame the plains, celebrated in song but forgotten in the historical ledger. The silent strength of the Central Pacific. If the Union Pacific was built by Irish muscle, the Central Pacific, working eastward from Sacramento, was built by Chinese ingenuity and sheer, relentless willpower. This is where the story of the unsung builders becomes most poignant. The Central Pacific faced a geological nightmare, the granite mountains of the Sierra Nevada. The Chinese workers, hired in mass after white workers proved too few and too unwilling to endure the crushing difficulty, took on the task that nearly broke the project. They were initially met with skepticism and racist scorn. Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four owners of the CP, had declared Chinese labor inferior. He was proven spectacularly wrong. Elias unearthed astonishing details about their work. They were paid less than their white counterparts, subjected to longer hours, and given the most dangerous tasks. Yet their efficiency, sobriety, and engineering discipline were unparalleled. Their signature achievement was Tunnel Number 6, the Summit Tunnel, which required blasting through 1,600 feet of solid granite at an elevation of 7,000 feet. The work continued through the brutal winter of 1866-1867, where over 40 feet of snow fell. The workers lived in tunnels carved under the snowdrifts, working 24 hours a day. They invented new techniques, including lowering men in baskets down sheer cliffs to chip and blast footholds. The casualty rate in the tunnels was catastrophic. The use of nitroglycerin, a volatile, unstable explosive, led to frequent, devastating accidents. It is estimated that thousands of Chinese workers died in the Sierra Nevada, their bodies often entombed within the very tunnels they were digging, as retrieval was too difficult and time-consuming. They were given no funerals, no markers, and for nearly a century, virtually no mention in American history books. Elias found a remarkable, forgotten document, a Central Pacific inventory list from 1869 that included 200 sets of burial linens, no names required. It was a cold, bureaucratic acknowledgement of mass death. These workers, dubbed the Celestial Race by their bosses in derogatory fashion, literally provided the silent foundation for the West. They built the most audacious section of the entire line, only to be excluded from the 1869 Golden Spike ceremony and systematically erased from the official narrative of American industrial triumph.
The Southern Scars and Forgotten Lines. Beyond the transcontinental epic, the railroads left countless localized scars. Elias investigated the myriad smaller feeder lines and the unheralded contribution of black laborers, particularly in the South and during the Reconstruction era. After the Civil War, vast portions of the Southern rail network lay in ruins. The back-breaking work of rebuilding these vital lines, laying new track, repairing bridges, and digging trenches fell largely to black crews, often comprising recently freedmen and, disturbingly, incarcerated men rented out under the oppressive convict leasing system. This was a forgotten infrastructure secret of its own, the use of slave-like forced labor to rebuild the very economic engine that had sustained the Confederacy and was now driving the New South.
These laborers endured conditions just as perilous as the Irish or the Chinese, often under the direct supervision of armed guards. Their contribution to the speed and resurrection of Southern industry is essential, but rarely attributed. Elias's research led him to the remnants of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad in Alabama, where he located the ruins of an old repair depot, now overgrown woodland. Using LiDAR data that showed unnatural depressions in the earth, he found a forgotten cemetery near a rail siding. The graves were unmarked, save for small, quartz fieldstones, typical of the burial practices for laborers with no formal identity or church affiliation. Through land deeds and oral histories he painstakingly gathered, Elias confirmed this was the resting place of dozens of black repairmen who died from disease, exhaustion, or accident while restoring the Confederate-era lines in the 1870s. The Iron Ghost Towns. The tracks themselves were not the only infrastructure ghosts. The entire system created, then abandoned thousands of structures. Elias journeyed to the high desert of Nevada, tracing the path of the original Central Pacific Line. In many places, the modern line had been rerouted for better grading or engineering efficiency, leaving the old path utterly desolate. These abandoned grades, known to rail historians as deadlines, are the ghost roads of the iron spine. He found sections where the old trackbed was still visible, cut cleanly through the sagebrush, but the ties and rails had been stripped away decades ago. Here stood the ruins of water towers, massive wooden structures now sun-bleached and collapsing, used to resupply the steam locomotives. Nearby were the stone foundations of small section houses, where the track maintenance crews lived in isolation, their families often miles away. These abandoned structures weren't just decay, they were monuments to an absolute commitment to speed, followed by absolute abandonment once technology advanced. They represent the ephemeral nature of American progress: move fast, discard quickly. One particular find in the Donner Pass region was especially chilling: a perfect, pristine section of an old snow shed built to protect the tracks from blizzards. This shed, built of massive timber beams, was bypassed in the 1920s by a shorter tunnel and had been left to rot. Inside, the air was still, cold, and smelled of creosote and old snowmelt. The walls were covered in faded carved graffiti, names and dates, almost all in Chinese script, left by the men who had spent their winters inside, guarding the tracks against the Sierra's fury. The silence in that shed was profound. It spoke of exhaustion, of cold, and of the thousands of men who labored and died so that goods and people could cross the continent in a single continuous line. Standing there, Elias realized the true nature of Manifest Destiny's iron spine. It was a dual monument, a triumph of engineering in one column and a vast, unmarked graveyard in the other. Every single mile of usable modern rail that connects America today rests on this forgotten infrastructure of sacrifice. The iron spine is not just a railroad, it's a vast, continuous historical burial ground waiting for the true story of its builders to be excavated and acknowledged.
Chapter 3: The Phantom Waterways, Canals that Shaped and Sank Cities. Dr. Elias Thorne understood that America had always been restless. It was a nation in perpetual motion, desperately seeking the quickest, cheapest way to move people and goods from the crowded Atlantic coast to the boundless interior. Before the iron spine of the railroads, before the concrete graveyard of the interstates, there was a brief, spectacular golden age ruled by water. The early 19th century witnessed canal mania, a frenzied period where state legislatures and private consortiums rushed to cut ditches across the landscape. The ambition was staggering: to tame the continent's wild hydrology, linking the Great Lakes to the Ohio River and the Ohio to the Chesapeake Bay. They were the superhighways of their time, and they birthed cities like Chicago and Buffalo. But for every success, like the mighty Erie Canal, there were dozens of failures, half-completed trenches and dried-up waterways that now crisscross the country, serving as the phantom veins of economic history. These are the phantom waterways, the infrastructure that promised boom but delivered bust, leaving behind towns that had invested everything only to be left high and dry, forever defined by the path the water refused to take. The doomed duality, Pennsylvania's great failure. Elias's first major investigation into the canals led him to Pennsylvania, where the state's political leaders, paralyzed by the overwhelming success of New York's Erie Canal, desperately sought their own route west. Their response was the Pennsylvania Main Line of Public Works, a project so ambitious and bizarre it stands as a testament to infrastructure folly. The plan was a monstrosity of competing technologies. Since the Appalachian Mountains stood squarely in the way, the engineers decided to simply string together different transportation methods into one massive system, a series of canals, ordinary railways, and, most famously, the Allegheny Portage Railroad. Elias traveled to the foothills near Hollidaysburg, tracing the path of the Portage Railroad. This was the centerpiece of the system, a 36-mile inclined plane railway designed to lift canal boats, wheels and all, over the steep mountain peaks. He visited the remnants of what should have been a world wonder. Imagine a narrow, specially designed railway track, ascending inclines so steep they required enormous stationary steam engines at the top to winch the canal boat up and over. The boat was placed on a wheeled cradle, disconnected from the water, and hoisted. It was a Rube Goldberg machine of continental scope, an engineering marvel born out of geographic necessity. The system worked, technically, but it was impossibly slow, expensive, and fragile. Transferring cargo, or entire boats, 5 times between canal, river, and railway added days to the journey and massive costs. When the simple continuous line of the standard railroad, like the Pennsylvania Railroad itself, the eventual corporate executioner, arrived, the mainline canal was instantly obsolete. It was a failure of imagination, or rather, a failure to anticipate the singularity of the steam locomotive. Elias walked the old towpaths of the canal segment near Johnstown. The canal prism, the actual trench where the water flowed, was still visible, a deep, unnaturally straight cut through the landscape, now overgrown with ancient trees. The once bustling basins were now mosquito-ridden swamps. But the greatest scars were the towns. Communities like Duncansville and Huntington had been designed, plotted, and built around the assumption of constant river-level commercial traffic. When the state sold the whole doomed system to the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1857, which promptly closed the canal sections and converted the rail links, these towns were immediately cut off. They suffered decades of economic stagnation, their populations frozen in time, forever smaller than their optimistic founders had planned. They became cities built for water commerce, but left to rot by the speed of steam. The promise of Metropolis, the fate of Seneca. To truly understand how a canal could sink a city, Elias had to look at the feeder canals, the speculative, purely entrepreneurial projects designed not to connect great bodies of water, but to simply bring commerce to one isolated boomtown. He focused on the fictitious but geographically representative Seneca Canal project in upstate New York. While the Erie Canal was humming, dozens of small investors tried to link their local towns to its bounty. The Seneca project, chartered in 1835, promised to bypass a difficult series of rapids and put the tiny village of Seneca, population 400, directly on a major north-south commerce route to Lake Ontario. The enthusiasm was infectious. Land speculation exploded. Local farmers sold off their fields for 10 times their agricultural value, believing they would soon be standing on future docks. A grand courthouse and 3 huge brick warehouses were built prematurely. The town's official seal, commissioned in 1838, featured a schooner floating majestically toward a lighthouse. The canal was dug by hand, a back-breaking 2-year effort. They completed 9 miles, including 3 impressive stone locks built by European masons before the money ran out. It wasn't incompetence that killed it. It was the panic of 1837. Bank failures, dried up investment, and the state, already heavily in debt from the Erie, refused a bailout. Elias stood in what was once the center of Seneca, New York. The courthouse foundation was still there, but the building was torn down in the 1890s for materials. The great brick warehouses were ruins, their roofless walls choked with ivy. The lighthouse on the town seal was a painful joke.
The crucial ruin was the Seneca Lock No. 2. It was a vast stone box, 100 feet long, 15 feet wide, and 12 feet deep, built from perfectly cut local limestone. It stood deep in a now private woodlot, entirely dry. It was so well constructed that it had not collapsed. It had simply endured, silent and empty. The gates were long gone, stolen for scrap during the Civil War, but the grooves where they once slid were clean. "It's the quietest place you'll ever find," said Jim, a local farmer who owned the land. "They say the town never recovered. Everyone who bought land, everyone who invested their crop money, they were ruined. They sold up and left. The whole promise of the town just dried up in that ditch." The town of Seneca never grew past 600 people. It wasn't bulldozed or flooded, it was simply paralyzed. The people who remained lived in the shadow of phantom wealth, surrounded by grand, optimistic ruins, a perfectly laid-out grid of streets that remained dirt tracks, and 3 imposing warehouses that housed only bats. The canal, by failing to bring water, had metaphorically drained the community of its future. The ghostly anatomy of the waterways. What makes the phantom waterways such unique infrastructure ghosts is their persistence in the landscape, even a century after their abandonment. Unlike railroads, which leave cuts and fills that can be repurposed as trails, or interstates, which are rebuilt, a failed canal is an environmental anomaly that resists reintegration. Elias spent time in Ohio, documenting the long, straight, watery ditches of the Ohio and Erie Canal and its lateral branches. He noted the distinctive features that remain. 1. The towpath trail. The path beside the canal, worn by the feet of mules pulling the barges, is often the most enduring physical remnant. Today, these are some of the most popular biking and hiking trails in the country, repurposed infrastructure that retains the ghost of the flow. 2. The aqueducts. These are the spectacular, bridge-like structures built to carry the water over rivers and ravines. Elias documented one aqueduct foundation in Indiana, where the stone piers stood perfectly aligned in the middle of a river, carrying nothing but wind. It was a skeletal bridge designed to float a highway of water, a monumental declaration that nature would not impede commerce. 3. The dry locks. Like Seneca Lock No. 2, these stone chambers stand as geological clocks. They are perfectly preserved artifacts of human scale, built when a lockkeeper was a vital profession. Today, they are often used by hikers as fire pits or picnic spots, their immense structural integrity repurposed for mundane, modern use. Elias realized that the phantom waterways didn't disappear. They became wetlands, property boundaries, and flood control challenges. The canal beds often became conduits for underground pipelines or telecom cables, the unnatural straightness of the original cut still serving the needs of speed and connectivity, just in a different medium. The greatest secret of the phantom waterways is not their physical decay, but their persistent invisible influence. The early routes laid out by these ambitious canals
Even the failed ones established the initial economic gravity of regions. The cities that won the canal race, New York, Chicago, became global centers. The cities that lost, like Philadelphia and its convoluted main line, or the towns that were built on the promise of the water, like Seneca, often became economic backwaters for generations. The geography of prosperity and poverty in the U.S. is often dictated by the ghost of a water channel that dried up 150 years ago. The towns that were promised a port and got a dry ditch never fully recovered. Elias ended his investigation by standing at the mouth of a long-abandoned canal segment near a modern-day wastewater treatment plant. The canal, briefly, was still used as a massive overflow trench. The ghost had returned, serving a vital, if inglorious, purpose. The water highway of the 1830s was now a sewage artery, the most fundamental and necessary kind of infrastructure, still running along the line of an old, forgotten dream. The phantom waterways, he concluded, were a perpetual reminder that in America, infrastructure failure is often just a long, slow transition into a new, less romantic utility. Chapter 4. A City Beneath the City. The Secret Tunnels of Urban America. For Dr. Elias Thorne, the true ghost roads were not those lost to the prairie or drowned by reservoirs. The most compelling secrets were those concealed in plain sight, directly beneath the manicured parks and bustling avenues of America's great cities. To walk the street level is to see the finished product. To understand the urban machine, you must go beneath the pavement, into the damp, silent world of the forgotten tunnels. Every major American city, from Boston's old utility runs to the complex catacombs of Chicago, rests on a tiered infrastructure. There is the bustling surface, the shallow layer of modern utility lines, and then, far below, the secret city, the original networks of movement, transportation, and sanitation, often abandoned or repurposed, but never truly removed. These tunnels are the unwritten history of urban ambition, a hidden museum of mismanaged projects and audacious engineering. The original rapid transit, New York's phantom subway. New York City's subway system is the busiest and most iconic underground network in the world. Yet the story of its genesis is riddled with secrecy and thwarted ambition, proving that even the most enduring infrastructure started as a ghost road. Elias's research led him not to the celebrated IRT or BMT lines, but to the forgotten vision of Alfred Ely Beach. In 1870, long before the city was ready to fund a municipal subway, Beach, a wealthy inventor and publisher, bypassed the notoriously corrupt Tammany Hall politicians who controlled the surface streets. He didn't ask permission, he simply started digging. The Beach Pneumatic Transit System was an experiment, a grand novelty built under the cover of night. Beach leased a basement lot near City Hall and claimed he was building a postal delivery system. What he was actually constructing was a single, massive 9-foot diameter tunnel beneath Broadway, intended to shuttle passengers in luxurious, velvet-lined cars propelled by enormous pressurized air fans. Elias reviewed the original engineering drawings. The tunnel itself was a technical marvel. Shield-driven, meaning it was dug using a massive circular shield, an early precursor to the tunneling technology used today. It was quiet, clean, and elegant, the antithesis of the grimy, noisy reality that would become the later municipal subway. Beach opened the single-block demonstration line between Warren and Murray Streets. It was an instant sensation, but also a political target. The Tammany boss, William Boss Tweed, who had his own interests in surface transit, used his immense power to block every one of Beach's expansion permits. The project died in political gridlock, the tunnel sealed off and forgotten. Elias located the former entrance, now underneath a modern department store basement. The tunnel was long ago cleared and mostly filled, but the legend endures. The beach subway was a true infrastructure ghost, a fully engineered, operational, and beautifully constructed segment of a rapid transit future that was stopped not by technical flaw, but by raw political obstruction. It sits as a phantom limb of the current subway network, a subterranean reminder that the best ideas don't always win. Chicago's deep secret, the freight tunnels. Chicago, a city defined by speed and vertical ambition, hid one of the most comprehensive and fascinating ghost networks in American history, the Chicago Tunnel Company's underground freight system. Starting in the early 1900s, while the city struggled with horse-drawn traffic congestion and a rapidly expanding population, a private company built an astonishing network of small-gauge tunnels beneath the loop. This was not for people, it was for commerce. The tunnels, which measured about 7 foot 5 inches high and 6 feet wide, stretched for over 60 miles, forming a dense, capillary network that connected nearly every major building, department store, train station, and post office in the downtown area. They moved coal for heat, ash for disposal, mail, packages, and even newspapers. Elias traveled to the Chicago History Museum, reviewing old maintenance blueprints that showed the staggering complexity. Imagine the entire loop operating silently, 40 feet below the bustling streets, with tiny electric trains hauling critical supplies. The system peaked around World War II, but the rise of diesel trucks, modern elevators, and stricter labor laws made the tunnels obsolete by the 1950s. The company folded, the tracks were pulled up, and the entry points were sealed. Today, these 60 miles of tunnels are a subterranean ghost maze. They are mostly empty, damp, and perfectly preserved in their state of abandonment. They house some telecom lines and fiber-optic cables, but mostly they just exist, a silent, empty infrastructure that once powered the city's commerce. The greatest secret of the tunnels is their occasional, dramatic resurgence. In 1992, a breach in the river wall caused the entire network to flood, crippling the loop's power and utility systems for weeks, an explosive reminder that the city still rested on its deep, forgotten secrets. The utilitarian ghosts. Washington, D.C.'s steam. The capital of the nation, Washington, D.C., holds a different kind of subterranean secret, a functional yet largely invisible network of tunnels that power the federal government. The Capitol Power Plant steam tunnel system is a restricted access infrastructure ghost. While not abandoned, its purpose and extent are unknown to the vast majority of citizens and visitors. It is a utility network of pipes and tunnels, some of them large enough to drive a small vehicle through, that distributes steam heat to the Capitol building, the Library of Congress, and other major federal buildings.
Elias secured rare historical photographs of the original construction, revealing crews digging through the marshy D.C. soil at the turn of the century. The construction challenges were immense, fighting constant groundwater and political opposition. This system is a secret, not because of suppression, but because of security and pure utilitarian function. It is a ghost road that still breathes, performing the essential, unglamorous work of keeping the government warm and running. Elias noted the distinction. The NYC tunnel was a political ghost. The Chicago tunnels were a commercial ghost. The DC tunnels are a sovereign ghost, critical infrastructure that must remain unseen to protect the operations of power. The urban footprint, tunnels of displacement. Beneath the glamour of these engineering feats lies a darker secret. The tunnels often represent the physical displacement of communities. In cities like Los Angeles and Seattle, the expansion of the early streetcar and trolley systems, often using short, dedicated tunnels through hills, required the clearance of neighborhoods. In Seattle, the historic underground was created not just by tunnels, but by the raising of street levels following the Great Fire of 1889, leaving the original ground floor businesses and sidewalks entombed beneath the new city grade. Elias explored the story of the Bellevue Avenue Tunnel in Los Angeles, part of the early streetcar system. It was a short, sharp cut through a hill in the Temple Bowlery neighborhood, built to expedite the commute of wealthier residents while often isolating or dividing the predominantly working-class and immigrant communities that lived on the hill itself. When the streetcar system died in the 1950s, the tunnel was sealed and forgotten. For decades, it existed as a perfect curved space beneath the modern roadway. Its secret lay in the fact that its existence, and later its removal, marked a profound geographical and social scar. It was a tunnel built for segregation and convenience that became a monument to a forgotten transit era. The secret city beneath our feet is often a map of who was prioritized and who was paved over. The final vaults. As Elias concluded his research on the secret city, he reflected on the most common yet least discussed tunnel ghost, the original sanitary sewers. The ambitious, combined sewer systems built in the 1880s and 1890s in places like Boston, Chicago, and Cincinnati were triumphs of public health engineering. They involved massive brick-lined tunnels, often as large as subway cars, designed to take both sewage and storm runoff away from population centers. Elias found a 1904 photograph of a sewer gang posing inside a newly completed section beneath Cincinnati. The tunnel was perfectly rounded, illuminated by early electric lights, and looked eerily like a brand new subway station. These were structures built to last forever, yet they operate silently, far below the public consciousness. He realized the irony. The most essential, life-sustaining infrastructure, the networks that keep the city from drowning in its own waste, are the least seen and the most taken for granted. They are the true, invisible foundation upon which all the visible monuments rest. The secret city, Elias concluded, is the sum of these hidden spaces. The ambitious failure of Beach, the commercial logic of Chicago, the sovereign necessity of D.C., and the silent work of sanitation. They are the ghost roads that constantly remind us that the complexity of modern American life is built on layers of forgotten effort, political sabotage, and hidden engineering brilliance, all waiting just beneath the soles of our shoes. Chapter 5. The Great Depression's Forgotten Architects, WPA and the Lost Projects. The ghost roads that came before the Great Depression, the suppressed canals, the brutally built railroads, were scars of ambition and greed. But the infrastructure ghosts of the 1930s were different. They were scars of necessity and political will, built not for corporate profit, but for national survival. They were the works of the New Deal, a colossal, unprecedented effort to lift a crippled America by putting millions back to work building the country itself. Dr. Elias Thorne viewed the New Deal agencies, the Works Progress Administration, the Public Works Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, as the most significant infrastructure force in American history, bar none. They built or improved nearly 1 million miles of roads, 100,000 bridges, 125,000 public buildings, and 8,000 parks. Yet the sheer, frantic scale of this building boom meant that it created an equal measure of unfinished, unused, or immediately abandoned projects. The WPA built the foundations of modern America, but also left a forgotten blueprint of what America almost became. The grand vision and the PWA's abrupt stop. The Public Works Administration was designed to tackle the large, capital-intensive projects, massive dams, naval bases, and critical utility systems. These projects required immense planning and time. When the political winds shifted or the money ran out, the PWA's abandoned sites were not small, dusty remnants, they were monumental failures. Elias focused his research on the American Southwest, where the New Deal's dual goals of power generation and irrigation often collided with unforeseen geological obstacles and state rivalries. He uncovered the history of the Mojave Regional Aqueduct and Power Station, MARPS, a PWA proposal from 1934 designed to divert water from the Colorado River much further north than the eventually successful Boulder Dam, Hoover Dam project. MARPS was a multi-state collaboration doomed by political infighting. The blueprints called for a 350-foot dam in a remote, almost inaccessible canyon and a 200-mile aqueduct that would have crossed the Mojave Desert, supplying water not only to growing urban centers, but crucially to vast tracts of undeveloped farmland in Nevada and Arizona. Elias found evidence that construction had actually begun. Using old aerial surveys, he located the initial staging area, a large cleared plateau outside what is now Laughlin, Nevada. The most striking remnant was the half-built mixer plant, a ghostly skeleton of steel and concrete rebar. The PWA had poured the enormous foundation pad for the concrete mixing towers designed to supply the tons of material needed for the dam face. Then, the funding was abruptly yanked by a politically charged amendment in Congress, favoring the southern route that became the Boulder Dam project. Today, the site is simply a perfectly flat, 100-yard square concrete pad in the middle of a rocky desert wilderness, accessed only by a faded, 6-lane-wide dirt road that abruptly shrinks to a 2-track path. It is a monument to the PWA's colossal industrial ambition, a massive foundation poured for a dam that never rose. The MARPS project didn't fail due to engineering error. It was canceled due to a lobbying victory by the state of California, which controlled the competing southern water interests. The ghost camps of the CCC. The CCC built some of the most enduring and beautiful infrastructure in the nation: fire lookouts, national park trails, and flood control systems. The CCC was less about concrete and steel and more about conservation and human labor. But their own infrastructure, the camps that housed them, vanished almost entirely. The CCC housed over 3 million young men in military-style camps scattered across the country. These camps, often located in remote national forests or future parklands, had their own internal infrastructure: barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and educational buildings. They were mini towns, operating for 5 or 6 years, and then, as after the men left to join the war effort, they were dismantled with startling efficiency. Elias visited the site of Camp 1421 in the Pisgah National Forest of North Carolina. Unlike the permanent stone structures the CCC often built for the public, the camp buildings themselves were mostly wood frame, designed to be temporary. He walked through a small clearing, looking for traces. There were no buildings, but the site was defined by its ghosts. He could clearly see the outlines of the 5 barracks buildings in the ground cover, linear patches of earth where the soil chemistry was subtly different due to years of floor sweeping and human habitation. The central flagpole foundation was still there, a small circular concrete disc now barely visible underneath a layer of pine needles. The greatest ghost was the drainage system. The CCC men, trained in engineering, had installed a complex series of French drains and stone-lined gutters to handle the mountain runoff. Elias discovered that these precise, hand-laid stone channels still functioned perfectly, diverting water away from where the mess hall used to stand. These were infrastructure remnants so well built that nature had not erased them, simply overgrown them. Camp 1421 was a ghost road not of materials, but of community. 300 young men lived, learned, and worked there, creating a vast infrastructure of trails and bridges for the forest, only to have their own homes completely eradicated. The silence of the forest floor now covers the echoes of their drilling, singing, and marching. It is a reminder that the New Deal not only built parks, but also systematically erased the infrastructure of its own creation, leaving behind only the perfection of its hydrological ghost. WPA's Monuments of Unfinished Civic Pride. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, focused on smaller, more immediate projects aimed at maximum employment: local schools, municipal swimming pools, auditoriums, and neighborhood parks. The projects that stalled, often just before completion, represent the most heartbreaking ghost roads. They are testaments to a small town's hopeful investment in the future that never quite arrived. Elias investigated the case of the Oakwood Municipal Natatorium in Oakwood, Illinois. Planned in 1938, the project was intended to be a grand civic center, a massive indoor swimming pool and gymnasium complex built with decorative Art Deco brickwork. It promised jobs and a community focal point for decades. WPA crews, many of whom were local tradesmen, worked for 2 years. They completed the foundation, the exterior walls, and the complex roof trusses. The defining element, the huge tiled pool basin, was perfectly dug, lined with concrete, and ready for the final layer of ceramic tile. Then, in late 1941, everything stopped. The reason was World War II. As the U.S. ramped up its defense industrial base, the flow of raw materials, steel, copper, and even high-quality ceramic tile, was immediately diverted to military production. The WPA programs, deemed non-essential, were suddenly terminated. The Oakwood Natatorium was left as a massive, roofed, but internally raw shell. Elias walked the perimeter of the abandoned structure. It was a local legend, a huge building that looked finished from the outside, but was a cavern of unfinished hope within. Inside, the massive, empty concrete pool basin dominated the space. It had never held water. For years, the town used it as a local dump, and later for skateboarding. The final layer of beautiful blue and white tile, necessary to make it watertight, had been requisitioned for a naval housing project in Virginia. The structure eventually found a grim second life as an unheated storage facility, its massive, elegant Art Deco exterior guarding stacks of old highway salt and election equipment. The people of Oakwood got jobs, but they never got their swimming pool. The natatorium is a WPA ghost of the highest order. Structurally sound, visually imposing, but functionally hollow, forever frozen at the moment the war machine demanded the nation's materials. The eradication and rebranding. The ultimate disappearance of WPA and PWA projects was often not decay, but intentional rebranding or eradication. After World War II, America was eager to shed the memory of the Depression. Many WPA-built schools, municipal buildings, and infrastructure components were suddenly seen as relics of a past the nation preferred to forget. They were quickly demolished or aggressively modernized with cheap mid-century materials, obscuring the original New Deal craftsmanship. Even more cynically, many WPA roads, bridges, and causeways were simply absorbed into the colossal interstate highway system planning that began in the 1950s. Elias found examples in West Virginia and Tennessee, where WPA built concrete roads, laid down in 1939 with great pride, were simply paved over or widened to become the foundations of the new U.S. highways, their origin stories deliberately erased from the dedication plaques. The WPA and PWA built so much, so fast, and so thoroughly that their ghosts are pervasive and insidious. They are the foundations we never question, the backroads we assume were always there, and the parks that look timeless. The political imperative was not just to build, but to erase the evidence of the economic desperation that required such an immense effort. Elias stood on the concrete pad of the unfinished Mojave mixer plant, looking out at the endless desert. He realized the New Deal ghost roads carry a distinct message. They are a paradox of American might. They prove that when motivated by crisis, the U.S. government could literally reshape the continent. But they also prove that this incredible collective effort is subject to the same sudden, violent cancellations, political corruption, and historical amnesia that plagued the earlier private ventures. The unforgotten architects of the Great Depression laid the groundwork for prosperity, but their true legacy lies in the quiet, empty spaces they left behind, the half-built dams and silent cement shells, monuments to a future that war and shifting politics decided America would never quite build. They are the hopeful ghosts of the New Deal era.
Chapter 6: Supersonic Dreams and Deserted Runways, the Cold War Legacy. The infrastructure ghosts Dr. Elias Thorne had cataloged so far were products of economic necessity, greed, or civic hope. the slow-motion failure of a railroad, or the quick collapse of a canal company. But the infrastructure ghosts of the Cold War were born of an entirely different emotion, existential fear. They were built for an apocalypse that never arrived, funded by an industrial complex that operated on technological hyper-obsolescence and abandoned the moment a faster, deeper, or more secretive deterrent was conceived. The Cold War was, in essence, an infrastructure race. It created sprawling complexes of concrete, steel, and advanced electronics designed to survive the unthinkable, and then, a few years later, deemed irrelevant by the same technological arms race they were built to facilitate. Elias referred to this landscape as the architecture of paranoia. It wasn't a hidden canal or a buried subway, it was a visible wound of monumental scale. Massive air bases built for planes that never flew, radar stations rotting in the Arctic, and missile silos now selling for the price of a suburban home. Elias began his investigation by studying the enormous empty fields of the American West, sites where the Strategic Air Command, SAC, had once ruled the skies. The ghostly grid of SAC, deserted runways. The heart of the Cold War machine was the bomber, the B-52, the B-47, and the later B-1. These aircraft required colossal infrastructure. SAC bases were deliberately placed far from major population centers, often in arid, featureless landscapes that provided clear approach paths and maximum blast protection. They were self-contained cities designed for war. Elias visited the remnants of the fictional but geographically representative Black Mesa Air Force Base in New Mexico. Once a bustling hub of global warfare, it had been mothballed in the late 1880s. The site's core lay in its runways, monolithic strips of concrete 12,000 feet long and several hundred feet wide. These weren't built for commercial jets, they were built to withstand the immense heat and weight of a fully loaded B-52 taking off in a hurry. Today, the primary runway at Black Mesa is a ghost road of concrete. It is cracked by the desert sun, occasionally used by hobbyist pilots, but mostly just sits there, an absurdly large engineered scar on the plateau. Elias walked the entire length of the concrete strip. It was a pilgrimage across a piece of infrastructure built to define global power, now defining only quiet decay. Near the central taxiway, he found the remnants of the alert infrastructure, the immediate readiness facilities that embodied the hair-trigger nature of the Cold War.
The nuclear-powered ghost, Project ANP. Perhaps the most ambitious and frightening infrastructure ghost of the era involved the attempt to build a nuclear-powered aircraft. This was Project ANP, Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion, a decades-long effort that aimed to create a bomber that could fly indefinitely, powered by an onboard reactor. Elias found the physical legacy of this failure deep within the National Reactor Testing Station in Idaho. The project never produced a flyable reactor, but it required the construction of immense custom infrastructure for ground testing. He focused on the remnants of the initial shielding test facility. This site was dominated by a colossal, heavily shielded concrete structure, a facility built to safely house and test the early prototype reactors on the ground. The walls were several feet thick, incorporating specialized lead and concrete alloys. It looked like a brutalist bunker designed to withstand a self-inflicted blast. The most bizarre feature was the test track extension, a short, heavily reinforced spur of rail track leading directly from the reactor building out to a large open plain. This track was built for the eventual purpose of mounting the shielded reactor engine on a massive rail car and transporting it for open-air radiation dispersal testing, a truly chilling concept. The whole project was killed in 1961 by President Kennedy, who recognized that the technology was impractical, dangerous, and already obsolete given the rise of ICBMs. The infrastructure, however, remains. The massive concrete shielding, the
The thick, barred doors and the ominous test track are still there, a ghost road built for a weapon of infinite endurance that never left the ground. It is a terrifying infrastructural artifact of a dream that was too big, too expensive, and too radioactive to ever be realized. The network of doomsday, buried silos. The most iconic Cold War ghosts are the missile silos. The Titan and Atlas ICBM programs required a massive, continent-spanning network of buried infrastructure, vast, multi-level concrete complexes that were intended to be the final, retaliatory strike. These silos were built in clusters across the Great Plains and the American Southwest, often on acquired farmland in Kansas, Colorado, and Arizona. The infrastructure was entirely subterranean, a concrete tube 150 feet deep connected to underground launch control centers, crew quarters, and support facilities via blast-hardened tunnels. Elias studied the transition of these sites from active military targets to commercial real estate. When the first-generation liquid-fueled missiles, Atlas and Titan I, were decommissioned in the 1960s, the Air Force sought to completely eradicate the infrastructure. But the cost of filling in a 150-foot deep, multi-level concrete bunker was prohibitive. Instead, many were simply sealed and sold off. He visited an abandoned Titan I complex in Arizona. The surface was unremarkable, a few concrete caps and ventilation grates, but beneath the desert scrub lay the infrastructure ghost. The LCC, Launch Control Center, a completely self-contained steel sphere suspended within a larger concrete vault designed to float during a seismic shock. It was a city within a sphere, with its own air, power, and communications. The blast doors, massive, hydraulically operated steel doors weighing several tons, designed to seal the complex from the atmosphere. The missile field represents the ghost of ultimate defense. These structures, built to survive a direct nuclear hit, are now monuments to their own technological replacement by smaller, solid-fueled and mobile Minuteman and Peacekeeper missiles. Their very obsolescence, their physical fixity, made them vulnerable and thus disposable. Today, these silos are sometimes sold for use as luxury bunkers, seed vaults, or even unusual homes, the ultimate, terrifying repurposing of a ghost road. A legacy of hyper-obsolescence. The ghost roads of the Cold War, the silent air bases, the warped rocket tracks, the shielded bunkers, and the buried silos carry a chilling lesson that separates them from all other American infrastructure failures. The canals failed because the railroad was faster. The WPA buildings failed because of war material shortages. The Cold War infrastructure failed because of an intentional, relentless, and designed obsolescence. The entire system was programmed to fail and be replaced, not through neglect, but through mandated technological superiority. Elias realized that the Cold War was not a story of building infrastructure to last, but of building infrastructure to be abandoned for the sake of survival. The immense cost, the massive scale, and the deep secrecy only underscore the profound speed with which America discards its foundations when fear, rather than commerce, is the driving force. Standing outside the locked entrance to the mole hole at Black Mesa, Elias saw the final truth of these Cold War ghosts. They are the physical scars of an era when the nation invested trillions, not in sustaining life, but in briefly delaying extinction. They are the silent concrete reminders of supersonic dreams that grounded out in the quiet desert, their purpose dissolved in the heat of a perpetual technological race. They are the ultimate negative space, monuments to a future that thankfully never came to pass.
Chapter 7. The Concrete Graveyard, When Interstates Went Awry. The canals were a whisper of water. The railroads were a thread of iron.
The interstates were a tectonic shift. In 1956, when President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, it initiated the largest public works project in world history. The interstate highway system was not merely a collection of roads, it was a promise of speed, mobility, military readiness, and national unity. It was America's final definitive answer to the question of continental connectivity. Dr. Elias Thorne recognized that the interstates represented the ultimate infrastructure paradox. They were the most successful, pervasive, and culturally defining set of structures ever built in the country, yet they created the most disruptive and irreparable ghost roads of all. These ghosts were not abandoned like a dried-up canal. They were violent ghosts, manifestations of eminent domain, community destruction, and architectural arrogance, leaving behind unfinished concrete leviathans that stand as monuments to political failure. The failures of the interstate era were not of engineering capacity, but of ethical calculus. Who gets moved? Whose history gets paved over? Whose money runs out? Elias called these relics the concrete graveyard. The great urban scars, the freeway revolts. The most dramatic and painful infrastructure ghosts are found not in the desert, but in the heart of America's oldest cities. The original plan for the interstates called for massive ring-like loops and direct spurs that would slice through dense urban cores, following the shortest possible route. These plans prioritized throughput over humanity, leading to the destruction of vibrant historic neighborhoods and the displacement of millions of people, particularly low-income and minority residents. This brutality led to the freeway revolts of the late 1960s and 1970s, where grassroots opposition finally achieved what no political corruption or financial failure had managed. They stopped the concrete machine cold. Elias focused on the story of the Harborfront Expressway in the fictional city of Portsmouth, Massachusetts, a composite of real-life aborted projects in Boston and Baltimore. The plan was simple: a massive 8-lane elevated highway designed to run directly along the historic waterfront, connecting the suburbs to the downtown business district and bypassing the old, narrow city streets. For 5 years, the state proceeded aggressively. They demolished hundreds of blocks of 19th-century brick tenements and wharves, displacing thousands of families and small businesses in the tight-knit Irish and Italian neighborhoods that defined the old port. They poured the foundations and erected the immense concrete columns, 30 feet tall, brutalist supports designed to hold the weight of 8 lanes of roaring traffic. Then, the political climate shifted. Led by local activists and backed by conservationists, a massive coalition fought the plan, arguing that the highway would permanently sever the city from its greatest asset, the harbor. After years of litigation and massive street protests, the federal funding was pulled in 1974. Elias visited the site, now a major waterfront park. He walked along the harborfront promenade, but every 50 feet he encountered the ghost. Embedded in the grass, perfectly aligned, were the stub-end piers, the enormous, square concrete foundation columns that were never capped. They rise 5 feet out of the ground, ending abruptly, monuments to the colossal plan that stopped mid-execution. They look like the ancient ruins of a forgotten aqueduct, built by giants for no discernible purpose. The highway was canceled, but the ghost remained. The communities that had been bulldozed were never rebuilt. The land was eventually repurposed for high-end condos and parks, cementing the infrastructure's greatest damage: the permanent geographical segregation and displacement of working-class people. The Harborfront Expressway did not fail. It was successfully stopped, but only after it had already delivered its greatest blow.
The dead-end sprawl, roads to nowhere. In the vast, sparsely populated areas of the Midwest and West, the ghost roads of the interstate era often take the form of the absurdly grand, the dramatically pointless, the dead-end spur. These were sections of highway built under the assumption that a small town would inevitably explode into a metropolis once connected to the national network, or built solely because a powerful congressman needed a project in his district. Elias drove to the remnants of the I-499 loop in western Kansas. I-499 was conceived as a 40-mile beltway around the small city of Prairie Junction, designed to facilitate non-existent industrial park traffic and connect to a future never-built north-south connector. The state managed to secure funding for a single 6-mile segment of the Eastern Arc. He found it rising out of the endless plains, a pristine 6-lane superhighway complete with smooth, white concrete, perfect safety railings, and high-intensity lighting. It was built to handle 80,000 vehicles a day. The reality was closer to 80. The 6-mile segment begins with a dramatic 3-level stack interchange, a massive structure of soaring concrete ramps that would be appropriate in Dallas or Atlanta. This interchange connects to a 2-lane county road. 6 miles later, the concrete abruptly ends at a perfectly graded dirt field where the future expansion was meant to begin. The effect is dizzying. It is flawless, high-speed infrastructure that forces the driver to slow from 75 miles per hour to 0 in a matter of yards. The effect is dizzying. It is flawless, high-speed infrastructure that forces the driver to slow from 75 miles per hour to 0 in a matter of yards. The junction is the real ghost, an architectural excess designed to facilitate complexity and flow, built for traffic that simply doesn't exist and likely never will.
Elias learned that the project was halted after the primary local industry, a massive meatpacking plant, relocated to Oklahoma, taking the predicted economic boom with it. The 6-mile segment remains, maintained yearly at massive cost, because decommissioning the structure is even more expensive than letting it stand empty. The I-499 loop is the perfect ghost of financial speculation, a road built on the guaranteed assumption of growth that was suddenly withdrawn. The environmental ghosts, the scars of mitigation. The interstate system's greatest sin, aside from displacement, was its arrogant disregard for the existing hydrology and ecology of the land. Rivers were straightened, marshes were filled, and mountains were blasted with impunity. The resulting ghost roads are not just the highways themselves, but the ancillary infrastructure built to mitigate the damage that often failed spectacularly. Elias traveled to the coastal marshlands of South Carolina to study the failure of the Spartina Causeway bypass. I-77 was pushed through the wetlands in the late 1960s, requiring massive amounts of dredged fill. To protect the surrounding marsh from the intrusion, the Army Corps of Engineers mandated the construction of a complex 3-mile-long tidal flow culvert system beneath the elevated causeway. This system involved a series of 15-foot diameter concrete culverts, designed with specialized flaps and weirs to allow the tide to move naturally through the marshland under the highway. When Elias arrived, the highway was still busy, roaring above the marsh. But beneath it, the culvert system had failed. The design was too complex, and the enormous flaps, the internal infrastructure of the culverts, had jammed due to silt buildup and corrosion years ago. Instead of a free-flowing marsh, the highway had created a permanent dam, dividing the ecosystem into 2 distinct, unhealthy zones. One constantly flooded and stagnant, the other overly dry and choked with invasive species. He kayaked beneath the roaring highway, maneuvering through the dark, cold concrete tunnels. The culverts, built with precision and expense, were now massive, useless tubes. They were infrastructure built as an apology to nature, and the apology itself failed, compounding the original sin. The ghost here is the ruined ecology, the miles of dead marsh that serve as the silent, stinking footprint of the interstates. The overbuilt defenses, the airfield fantasy. One of the enduring myths of the interstate system is that it was designed specifically for military use, as emergency landing strips for aircraft or for rapid troop movement during a Cold War invasion. While troop movement was a primary justification, the airfield component resulted in peculiar, overbuilt features that are now infrastructure ghosts. Elias investigated a stretch of what he called the emergency runway segment in rural Montana, a section of I-94. This stretch, built in the early 1960s, was noticeably different from the surrounding pavement. It was unusually straight, lacking any roadside obstacles, and featured extremely thick, reinforced concrete that extended into the median and shoulders. Most notably, the segment lacked the usual concrete joints every few feet. It was poured in a single, continuous mile-long strip. This was the airfield-grade concrete, designed to handle the high impact and weight of a military cargo plane. The plan was that during a national emergency, maintenance crews would quickly remove the center median barriers and use the 4 lanes as a temporary runway. The idea was quickly abandoned due to the impracticality of coordinating air traffic with the civilian highway system. Today, that mile of I-94 remains. The extra thick concrete is still there, virtually impervious to normal wear and tear, far outliving the surrounding pavement, which has been resurfaced multiple times. It is a ghost of a strategic defense fantasy, superfluous infrastructure built with a quality and cost that vastly exceeded its actual civilian need, now quietly carrying family sedans across the prairie. The concrete legacy. The ghost roads of the concrete graveyard are unique because they are fundamentally monuments to waste. Waste of capital, waste of community, and waste of land. They are the antithesis of the WPA's necessity-driven projects or the Canal era's entrepreneurial ambition. The interstate ghosts were created by a government that for the first time had seemingly limitless resources and political mandate, yet still stumbled violently into failure. Elias finished his notes beside the massive, unnecessary junction in Kansas. The interstates were a defining success story, but their failures, the empty spurs, the aborted ramps, the severed neighborhoods, and the choked waterways, are the most eloquent critics of American progress. They remind us that when infrastructure is designed solely for mechanical efficiency, getting from point A to point B the quickest way possible, it often fails to account for the human or ecological friction it creates. The concrete graveyard is the result, a massive permanent set of monuments that failed to deliver on their promise, now standing silent, waiting for the wind to sweep across their empty lanes. They are the final, terrifying testament to the ghost road history, that the greatest ambition often creates the largest, most enduring scars.
Chapter 8. Powering the Past, the Drowned Towns and Hydroelectric Ghosts. The canals failed because the machine arrived. The railroads failed because the asphalt came. The interstate failures were the scars of arrogance. But the greatest, most profound, and most permanent infrastructure ghosts of the 20th century were created by an act of deliberate, state-mandated burial, the hydroelectric age. For Dr. Elias Thorne, dams were the ultimate paradox. They were the apex predator of American infrastructure, structures built to last geological ages, designed to capture one of nature's most relentless forces, water, and convert it into the lifeblood of modernity, electricity. A dam is not a passive structure, it is an economic and ecological dictator. It creates winners, the downstream cities, the industrial parks, the irrigated farms, and losers, everything upstream. The ghost roads of the hydroelectric era are unlike any others. They are not merely overgrown or abandoned, they are submerged. Beneath the shimmering, placid surface of countless reservoirs lie entire communities, churches, farms, roads, and graves, perfectly preserved, silent monuments to the cost of American power. Elias referred to these relics as the drowned towns. The Great Flood of Progress, TVA and the Sacrifice Zone. The most aggressive and consequential dam-building entity in American history was the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. Born during the Depression, the TVA was mandated not just to generate power, but to control flooding, manage navigation, and uplift an entire poverty-stricken region through federally directed modernization. This mission, while noble, required a level of governmental seizure and displacement that was unprecedented. Elias traveled to the foothills of the Appalachians in Tennessee to study the creation of Clinch River Reservoir, a composite of several real TVA projects. The dam, built in 1937, was a marvel of concrete, standing 200 feet high. Its purpose was to feed a hydro plant that powered the regional electrification drive and, later, the massive aluminum production needed for World War II. The reservoir created by the dam consumed 60,000 acres of prime bottomland, a region settled by families whose names stretched back to the 1790s. The Sacrifice Zone was the fictional town of Redemption, Tennessee, a prosperous valley community of 1,200 people, complete with its own bank, 2 mills, a red brick high school, and a beloved town square dominated by a statue of a Confederate veteran. The process of displacement was systematic and cruel. TVA engineers gave the residents 1 year to sell their land, dismantle their homes, and move out before the valley was sealed and flooded. The compensation, determined by the government, was often inadequate to buy comparable farmland elsewhere, scattering tight-knit communities across 4 counties. Elias interviewed Sarah, an 80-year-old former resident of Redemption, who recalled the eerie final days. "It wasn't a disaster, it was a liquidation," she said. "TVA told us we could take the houses apart, or they'd burn them so the logs wouldn't float up and hit the dam. We watched the smoke from the ridge for 3 days. Our whole history went up in flame." The most traumatic infrastructure ghost, however, was the graveyard relocation. Federal law stipulated that all marked graves must be moved. TVA employed crews to painstakingly dig up and relocate over 3,000 bodies from dozens of small family cemeteries and the town graveyard. Elias found the original TVA forms, meticulous engineering documents detailing the exact coordinates of the original burial plot and the new plot on the reservoir's high banks. The process was deeply dehumanizing. The deceased became data points, their eternal rest subject to the needs of the electrical grid. The town itself was not completely liquidated. Just before the gates closed, the TVA dynamited the largest structures, the bank and the mills, to prevent them from becoming navigational hazards. But the majority of the town, the streets, the foundations, the well-constructed brick high school, and the statue in the town square were simply left. Elias, utilizing advanced sonar and historical maps, pinpointed the center of Redemption. Today, it lies 150 feet below the surface. On certain drought years, when the water level is drawn down dramatically for power generation, the top of the Redemption High School gymnasium roof can sometimes break the surface, a geometric anomaly in the water, a fleeting ghost road of red brick and concrete. This is the ultimate paradox of the drowned towns. They are still structurally sound, perfectly preserved by the cold, deep water, but entirely removed from human interaction. Redemption did not fail. It was sacrificed. It is the silent, submerged testament to the painful trade-off between rural legacy and national energy security. The Western Water Wars, sacrificing natural wonders. While the TVA focused on the human cost of power in the East, the Bureau of Reclamation in the West, particularly in the post-WW2 era, focused on the ethical cost of water and irrigation. Their dams were often less about towns and more about the irreplaceable loss of geological history. Elias journeyed to the fictionalized Lake Cimarron in the borderlands of Colorado and Utah, a massive reservoir built in the 1960s to supply water to the burgeoning cities of the Front Range and to power a large aluminum smelter. The dam itself was engineered with near total disregard for the unique geography it destroyed. To create the necessary storage capacity, the Bureau of Reclamation deliberately flooded the Lost Canyon of the Painted Gods, a side canyon of the Colorado River that held one of the highest concentrations of pristine ancestral Poblaoan cliff dwellings in the American Southwest, alongside spectacular geological formations known as sandstone cathedrals. The flooding of the Lost Canyon was fought in Congress for nearly a decade by nascent environmental and archaeological groups. The argument was simple. The canyon was a national treasure that once lost could never be recovered. The Bureau's counter-argument was blunt. Denver needed water and the nation needed cheap aluminum. Infrastructure 1. Elias hired a specialty dive team to examine the entrance to the Lost Canyon, now an underwater chasm. At 80 feet deep, he viewed the ghost road of the canyon floor. The water had created an artificial stillness, yet the ancient human infrastructure remained. He saw the perfectly preserved low-lying foundations of ancestral Poblaoan storage kivas, round stone-lined pits used for grain storage, now encased in silt. Higher up the canyon walls, visible only in the clearest water, were the entrances to the cliff dwellings, their small, dark openings resembling empty eyes looking out into the silent water. The walls were still covered with faint pictographs, preserved not by air, but by the water's exclusion of oxygen. The ghost here is 1,000-year-old history. Unlike redemption, which could be resurrected in memory, the Lost Canyon is permanently removed from the human record. It is a sealed vault of ancient infrastructure and unique natural formation, sacrificed for a 20-year burst of industrial power and urban expansion. The Ghost Road is the lost path of ancient humanity, now serving as the bottom of a municipal water supply.
The temporary ghosts. Infrastructure to build infrastructure. Beyond the permanent ghosts of the drowned towns and canyons, the hydroelectric era also generated a massive network of temporary infrastructure. Ghost roads, built solely to serve the dam construction itself, only to be dismantled or deliberately submerged once the dam was complete. Elias focused on the construction site of the fictional Blue Ridge Dam in North Carolina. Building a structure of that magnitude required 1. The aggregate railway, a temporary, narrow-gauge railroad built to haul millions of tons of sand, gravel, and cement from the nearest mainline rail connection to the remote construction site. This rail line was often hastily laid, following the easiest, though often temporary, path through the wilderness. 2. The construction town, a self-contained, temporary city of barracks, offices, hospitals, and workshops for the thousands of engineers and laborers. A new, highly organized version of the old hell-on-wheels railroad camps. 3. The Coffer Dam, the most crucial ghost infrastructure. A temporary dam, often a massive earthen mound, built upstream to divert the river and allow the engineers to build the main concrete structure on dry bedrock. Once the main dam was finished and the gates closed, the Coffer Dam was simply flooded and submerged, its structure intentionally sacrificed to the new lake. Elias traced the old aggregate railway line. After the dam was finished in 1952, the tracks were pulled up and sold for scrap. The only remnants today are the unnaturally straight, raised railbed, a low, linear earthen scar running for miles through the forest. It is a hiking trail today, but the geological cut and fill still speaks of the frantic, short-lived effort to bring materials to the site.
He hiked to the site of the submerged coffer dam. Local fishermen knew it as the Hump, a shallow rise in the middle of the lake that was a notorious snag for fishing lines. This submerged earthen wall, built with immense effort and cost, still dictates the flow patterns of the reservoir and silently resists full erosion. It is infrastructure built to be abandoned, the temporary ghost that ensured the permanent one could stand. The ecological ghosts, silting and silence. The dam's influence extends far beyond its immediate reservoir boundary. The ecological ghost roads created by hydroelectric power are invisible but profound. A dam fundamentally alters the environment in two critical ways. One, upstream, the lake. The creation of the reservoir dramatically slows the river's flow, causing heavy silt and sediment, which once enriched the downstream floodplains, to drop out and accumulate at the upper end of the lake. This silting slowly and irreversibly fills the reservoir, reducing its capacity and burying the remnants of the drowned towns in layers of mud. 2. Downstream, the river. The water released from the dam comes from the deep bottom of the reservoir, meaning it is unnaturally cold and often oxygen depleted. This drastically changes the river's temperature and chemical profile for hundreds of miles, killing off native species, like trout or salmon, that rely on warm, shallow water or specific spawning runs, and replacing them with non-native, cold-tolerant species. Elias spent time on the tailwaters below a major dam in Idaho, fly fishing in the unnaturally cold water. The river was beautiful, but silent. The native ecosystem was a ghost, replaced by an artificial one sustained by the dam's cold release. The silent ghost here is the lost fish run, the ancient invisible pathway of salmon and other migratory fish that used to define the rhythm of the river. The dam is an absolute structural barrier, ending a flow of life that had existed for 10,000 years. The infrastructure ghost is the sudden, permanent ecological silence of a once vibrant river. The power of paradox. The ghost roads of the hydroelectric age are the most unsettling because they are not simply ruins. They are vital, functional components of the modern world. The buried towns of the TVA are the literal source of the power that lights up Atlanta and Charlotte. The submerged canyon walls hold the water that irrigates California's Central Valley. Elias stood high on the crest of the Clinch River Dam, feeling the low, rhythmic hum of the generators below. He looked out over the vast, shimmering surface of the reservoir. The interstates left scars of political failure on the surface. The railroads left scars of greed in the mountains. But the dams left scars of moral calculus, the silent, submerged sacrifice of communities, history, and nature, all traded for the relentless march of industrial capacity. The drowned towns are the final, terrifying reminder of the cost of progress. They are the true ghost roads, perpetually out of reach, perfectly preserved, and silently providing the energy that allows the living to forget they ever were there. America is powered by its dead, and the reservoir is their vast, beautiful, liquid tomb.
Chapter 9. The Bridge to Nowhere. Unused Spans and Financial Follies. The ghost roads that came before, the canals of necessity, the railways of expansion, the interstates of ambition, and the dams of sacrifice, all left behind scars. But a bridge, in its purest form, is different. A bridge is a singular, intentional gesture. It is the architectural representation of a promise, a guarantee of passage, connection, and continuity. When a bridge fails to meet its purpose, it becomes the most visually dramatic and psychologically potent of all infrastructure ghosts. It is a promise broken, often mid-span, soaring over a river, a canyon, or a forgotten marsh, connecting only the land of here to the land of never. Dr. Elias Thorne argued that these unused spans were the purest expression of financial and political corruption in the infrastructure history of the United States. Unlike a canal that simply dried up or a highway that became obsolete, the bridge to nowhere was often built with the full, certain knowledge that it was superfluous, a structure whose primary function was not connectivity, but the transfer of taxpayer funds into private hands. These bridges are monuments not to progress, but to folly. The emblem of earmarks, the Gravina River crossing. The most famous type of ghost bridge is the one created by pure political pork, the structure designed solely to funnel money into a specific district, regardless of public need. Elias created a composite case study, drawing inspiration from various real-world projects like the Gravina Island Bridge debacle in Alaska and other high-cost, low-utility spans in the Southeast. He called his subject the Okeechobee Span. The Okeechobee Span was authorized in 2003 as a $210 million project in a remote coastal district of the Gulf South. Its purpose was to connect the mainland highway system to a sparsely inhabited barrier island, Île des Fleurs, which was home to a struggling fishing village and a state-owned wildlife refuge. The justification was twofold: economic development, a promised future casino resort, and disaster evacuation route. The reality was that the island's permanent population was under 50 people, and the proposed evacuation route would lead traffic from one small island directly onto another, equally vulnerable island. The true motivation was the political clout of the district's long-serving congressman, who ensured the project was buried deep within a massive appropriations bill, a classic earmark. The engineering was Herculean. The span had to cross 3 miles of deep, churning tidal marsh and a significant shipping channel. Construction began quickly, fueled by the rush of federal dollars. For 3 years, the most visible signs of the project were the massive temporary construction islands built in the marsh and the steady procession of barges carrying prefabricated steel trusses. Elias visited the site, taking a small boat through the winding estuaries. What he found was staggering. The construction was not half done, it was 2/3 complete, then abruptly abandoned. Rising 80 feet above the water were 12 massive concrete piers, capped with bright yellow protective bumpers. Resting upon these piers was the bridge deck, a flawless 4-lane span of highway stretching 2 miles from the mainland shore. It stopped dead center, exactly at the midpoint of the shipping channel. The Okeechobee Gap was 5,000 feet wide, an intentional, engineered missing link. After years of national ridicule, the earmark was publicly killed in 2006, but only after the vast majority of the funds had been spent on the most complex and expensive part of the construction. The resort never materialized. The island's permanent residents refused to relocate. The Okeechobee Span is the perfect ghost of political pork. It is a useless structure that cannot be finished and cannot be used. It stands as a perpetual, high-profile liability, exposed to hurricanes and erosion, requiring constant maintenance for a road that carries zero traffic. The cost to finish the remaining gap is $150 million, and the cost to tear down the existing structure is $50 million. The political consensus? To do nothing. To simply let the ghost bridge stand, a $210 million testament to the priorities of a distant capital. The speculative collapse, the private toll folly. The second category of ghost bridge is driven not by political ego, but by speculative finance and the deregulation of infrastructure construction. In the late 1990s and 2000s, private equity groups, often backed by foreign investment, secured lucrative concessions to build and operate toll roads and bridges, banking on exponential regional growth. When the predicted growth failed to materialize or when economic crises hit, these projects failed spectacularly, leaving behind vast privately owned ruins. Elias studied the Erie Canal Connector Bridge in the Rust Belt region of Ohio, a project conceived in 2007. The plan was to build a privately financed, 6-lane cable-stayed bridge crossing the heavily industrialized Cuyahoga River Valley, connecting a planned sprawling new residential development on the western ridge with a soon-to-be-expanded logistics hub on the eastern bank. The financiers projected traffic numbers based on a 40% population increase over 10 years. They calculated a massive internal rate of return, financed the construction with high-risk bonds, and started construction immediately. The bridge was nearly finished when the 2008 financial crisis hit. The residential developer went bankrupt. The logistics hub expansion was canceled. The anchor project, the very reason for the bridge's existence, vanished overnight.
Elias walked the Erie Connector Bridge, a mile-long structure that was 95% complete. It featured state-of-the-art tolling gantries, perfect concrete, pristine safety barriers, and even the necessary expansion joints for thermal contraction. It just had no road connected to either end. On the western side, the 6 lanes of the bridge deck terminated abruptly, 20 feet above a dense, abandoned factory complex. On the eastern side, the approach ramp ended in an overgrown field that was supposed to be the new logistics park. The guardrail, designed to smoothly transition from bridge to road, ended mid-air. The bridge became the property of the bondholders, a consortium of banks and investment firms who had no interest in building the connecting infrastructure, only in salvaging some of their investment. Because the bridge was privately owned, the state refused to bail it out. The ghost road here is owned by finance. It is infrastructure too valuable to demolish, but too useless to complete. It stands today as a haunting symbol of the 2008 financial collapse, a monument of concrete and debt, an eternal reminder that even the most massive structures can be orphaned by a spreadsheet failure. It is estimated that 1 person a week attempts to climb or walk the bridge, drawn by its sheer uselessness, requiring the local police to patrol a 6-lane highway that has never carried a single vehicle. The rerouted ruin, the interstate ghost. Sometimes a bridge becomes a ghost simply because the larger infrastructure that required it changed its mind. These are the bridges that were built not for local use, but as essential components of a major national network, only to be discarded by a bureaucratic adjustment. Elias examined the I-69 spur bridge over the Red River in Arkansas. In the mid-1970s, the planned route for a major north-south interstate spur was finalized, requiring a massive dual-span, mile-long bridge to cross the wide river and its floodplain. The state built the bridge first, fearing rising material costs and environmental opposition to a river crossing. They completed the western span, the southbound lanes, and the central piers for the eastern span. Then, local political opposition tied to environmental concerns over the impact on a national forest 20 miles north succeeded in having the I-69 route shifted 10 miles west. The new route required a much shorter, cheaper crossing upstream. The first bridge, now unnecessary, was immediately orphaned. The construction crews simply packed up, leaving the finished southbound span soaring silently over the water. Elias chartered a helicopter to get the full scope of this ghost. From above, the I-69 spur bridge looked like a complete, fully functional, and ready-to-use highway. The asphalt was perfect, the striping was pristine, and the reflective barriers were spotless. But at the eastern bank, the southbound lane terminated in a massive, flat field of graded earth that had once been an on-ramp. No road leads to it, and no road leaves it. The eastern piers, already built but uncapped by the deck, stand naked in the middle of the river, their rebar rusting in the current. The single finished span is a half bridge connecting an unfinished foundation to a field. This bridge is the purest definition of an infrastructure ghost, built perfectly to serve a route that no longer exists. The ghost is the lost alignment, the highway that was supposed to run beneath your feet, now rerouted to the horizon. It stands as a testament to the fact that in the world of massive infrastructure, timing is everything. A 5-year delay in planning can render a 50-year structure entirely useless. The environmental barrier, the bridge that can't be used. The most frustrating bridges are those that were fully completed, open to the public, and then immediately deemed unusable or dangerously defective. These failures often stem from a combination of poor geological surveys, rushed construction, and an arrogant belief that engineering could easily override environmental realities. Elias visited the Devil's Slide Viaduct in Northern California, a fictional bridge representing real-world failures stemming from unstable geology along the Pacific coast. The viaduct was a 1.5-mile segment of coastal highway built on a series of concrete arches to bypass a notoriously unstable section of mountainside prone to landslides. The $400 million bridge was completed in 1995 and immediately hailed as an engineering triumph. However, 2 months after its opening, the winter rains began. The extensive drilling and foundation work on the mountain flank, despite the engineers' assurances, had destabilized the entire upper slope. Not only did the old section of road slide, but the enormous weight of the new viaduct triggered deeper, more profound movements. The bridge itself was sound, but its northern approach shifted 7 feet vertically, buckling the final expansion joint. The entire structure was declared unsafe for vehicle traffic due to the possibility of catastrophic failure in the next seismic event or heavy rain. The state tried mitigation for 5 years, pumping grout, pouring concrete buttresses, and installing massive geotechnical stabilizers. Nothing worked. The bridge was closed and fenced off permanently. Today, the Devil's Slide Viaduct is a perfectly paved, gorgeous stretch of 4-lane highway with a panoramic view of the Pacific. It is complete, sound, and ready for traffic, yet blocked by reinforced steel and warning signs. The ghost bridge here is one of geological defiance. It is the symbol of humanity attempting to impose massive infrastructure onto a volatile landscape and failing. The only permitted traffic is Elias and his team, who walk the pristine road, the sound of the Pacific waves drowning out the silence where thousands of car engines should be roaring. The bridge is the most expensive, most beautiful, and most exclusive pedestrian path in the state, a 4-lane highway reserved for the wind and the occasional seabird. The audacity of failure. The bridge to nowhere is the ultimate, non-negotiable symbol of American infrastructure waste. A railroad siding can be salvaged, a highway can be converted to a bike path, a dam can be removed. But a bridge, by its very nature, demands completion to justify its existence. When it stands useless, it represents hundreds of millions of dollars of sunk cost, political arrogance, and speculative debt hanging in the air. Elias stood on the edge of the Okeechobee span, watching the tides wash over the salt marsh below the massive, perfect concrete pier. They say infrastructure defines a civilization, he wrote in his journal. But what does it say about us when our most permanent structures, the ones built to connect and endure, are designed to fail? The ghost roads of the canals and rail were accidents of history. The ghost roads of the bridges are acts of betrayal. The financial follies of the unused spans are the bitter legacy of the American infrastructure saga. They are not merely ghosts of the past, they are permanent warnings, frozen mid-gesture, demonstrating that money, not genuine need or engineering necessity, often dictates where and how America builds its most enduring monuments. The ghost bridge remains, waiting for a traffic count that will never arrive.
Chapter 10. America's Nuclear Bones, Waste Sites, and Experimental Reactors. The ghost roads of the canals were a century long. The ghosts of the dams were measured in millennia of preservation. But the infrastructure ghosts of the nuclear age are measured in deep time, half-lives of 10,000 years, demanding engineering solutions that must survive the rise and fall of civilizations. Nuclear infrastructure is not built to be abandoned. It is built to be sealed. It is the only physical legacy of the American century that is fundamentally hostile to human touch, a colossal, invisible problem we inherited from the engineers who promised electricity too cheap to meter. For Dr. Elias Thorne, the sites of America's nuclear past, the experimental reactors, the decommissioned processing centers, and the permanent waste repositories are the nation's deepest, most ethical infrastructure challenge. These facilities are the nuclear bones, structures buried not by earth or water, but by concrete, lead, and the profound weight of future responsibility. Part 1. The White Elephants of the Atom. The first wave of nuclear ghost infrastructure came from the relentless, optimistic experimentation of the post-war era. Driven by boundless optimism and Cold War urgency, dozens of experimental reactors were built in remote landscapes, designed to test technologies ranging from breeder reactors to gas-cooled systems. Many were built, run for a few successful years, and then, due to economic impracticality or technological dead ends, were simply shut down and sealed. Elias traveled to the remote Idaho desert to study the fictionalized Midwest Atom Institute, MAI, a site representing the dozens of small, quickly retired reactors scattered across the western states. The MAI reactor, dubbed the Prometheus, was an ambitious liquid metal fast breeder reactor, LMFBR, designed in the 1960s to create more plutonium fuel than it consumed. It operated for 5 years and was decommissioned in 1975. When a nuclear facility is decommissioned, the most dangerous part of the infrastructure, the reactor core and its pressurized containment vessel, cannot be moved. It must be permanently entombed on site, a process called entombment, or SAF store, safe storage. Elias, wearing specialized protective gear, was escorted to the entombment site. All that remained visible of the original reactor building was a massive, seamless dome of reinforced concrete, 150 feet in diameter, covered in gravel and labeled only with a single bureaucratic plaque. MAI-1, Facility, Storage Status Class 3, Controlled Access, Permanent Seal in 1990. Under that dome lies the reactor, the heat exchangers, the control rods, the miles of sodium coolant pipes, and the graphite moderator, all still dangerously radioactive. The ghost road here is not a path. It is the sarcophagus. It is an infrastructure built to contain another, more lethal infrastructure. The concrete must remain stable for at least 300 years until the majority of the induced radioactivity decays. The engineers who designed it knew they were designing the first piece of American infrastructure that must outlive its nation. The surrounding area holds other ghosts. The coolant tank farm, a massive cylindrical tanks now empty that once held tens of thousands of gallons of radioactive sodium, all of it buried beneath clay and concrete caps. The original control room was locked in 1975. Elias was permitted to view it through a thick, double-paned window. Inside, dust lay thick over consoles labeled neutron flux and emergency scram. Charts of early successful power curves still hung yellowed on the walls. The ghost in this room is the utopian promise of limitless energy, a promise made by the engineers of the 1960s that now only resides in a sealed room, watched over by a silent, decaying machine. Part 2. The Infrastructure of Deep Time. If the reactors are the ghosts of technology, The waste sites are the ghosts of ethics. The most profound infrastructure challenge of the nuclear age is high-level radioactive waste, HLW, which includes spent fuel rods and waste from weapons production. This material must be isolated from the biosphere for up to 240,000 years, far longer than Homo sapiens has existed as a species. Elias focused on the infrastructure designed specifically for permanent storage, studying the fictionalized Salt Dome Repository in New Mexico, modeled after the real-world Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, WIPP. The SDR is a massive, deep geological facility carved out of an ancient, stable salt formation 2,150 feet beneath the desert floor. The infrastructure is not meant to be seen. It is meant to be permanent. The visible infrastructure consists of a massive security compound and a functional elevator shaft. Beneath the surface, the infrastructure is a vast, subterranean grid of mined rooms and corridors, each the length of several football fields. The design is a sophisticated, multi-layered system. 1. The transport tunnels. Miles of underground roads specifically built to handle the immense weight of the HLW canisters. 2. The storage rooms. Vast salt caverns where waste is placed in engineered pits, which will eventually be backfilled with crushed salt. The key mechanism of storage is geological sealing. Over time, the salt rock, being slightly plastic, will slowly creep and naturally seal all the waste rooms, burying the waste permanently under a dome of solid salt. 3. The concrete seals. Massive, multi-ton concrete and steel bulkheads designed to seal the access shafts, the last pieces of human-built infrastructure that will be installed before the final permanent closure. The deepest, most unsettling ghost road is the access ramp, the single, spiraling tunnel leading from the surface down to the waste placement level. It is paved, lit, and perfectly maintained, a road whose only purpose is to take the most lethal material ever created to its final, unreachable resting place. When the repository is full, this road will be sealed and forgotten. The most famous ghost associated with these sites, however, is not the underground tunnels, but the communication strategy. How does one communicate danger, lethal radioactive waste below, to a civilization 10,000 years from now, whose language, culture, and symbols are entirely unknown? The engineers designed the infrastructure of communication, massive earth-mound berms designed to look unnatural and ominous, markers inscribed in multiple languages, English, Spanish, Chinese, Navajo, and Russian, and even pictogram panels illustrating sickness and death. Elias held a mock-up of one of the proposed granite markers. It was inscribed with the words, "This place is not a place of honor. Nothing of value is here. The material contained here is dangerous and remains so for 10,000 years. The ghost road of the SDR is not physical. It is linguistic and temporal. It is the desperate, silent message from one age to another, a piece of infrastructure whose failure to communicate could lead to catastrophe. It is the only infrastructure ghost whose danger lies not in what it was, but in what it is, and what it will remain long after the memory of its builders has turned to dust."
Part 3. The invisible infrastructure. Contamination plumes. The infrastructure of the atomic age also created vast, sprawling environmental ghost zones, especially around the major production centers that manufactured plutonium and uranium for the nuclear arsenal. These sites, like the fictionalized Plutonium Canyon in Washington state, operated at a breakneck pace for decades, often disposing of liquid radioactive waste directly into the soil and groundwater. Plutonium Canyon was designed around massive, isolated processing canyons, concrete structures the size of aircraft carriers, where highly radioactive fuel rods were dissolved in acid to extract weaponizable materials. The waste was then transferred to enormous underground tanks. Elias studied the site today, a vast federal reserve that is perpetually being cleaned up, a decades-long multi-billion-dollar effort that may never truly be finished. The infrastructure here is the scars of production. The tank farms, hundreds of massive subterranean steel-lined tanks, some of which have developed cracks, allowing millions of gallons of high-level waste sludge to leak into the soil. The ghost infrastructure is the buried tank, a massive vessel that has failed in its primary containment mission. The tunnels and trenches, miles of abandoned, unlined disposal trenches and tunnels where contaminated cooling water and low-level waste were simply poured out into the soil. These trenches have since been capped and covered, but they defined the subsurface geography. The primary ghost road of the Plutonium Canyon is the contamination plume, an invisible subterranean infrastructure of pollution. This is a massive body of radioactive groundwater that has spread beneath the canyon, slowly following the natural geological flow toward the nearest major river. This plume defines the new invisible boundary of the ghost road, a toxic infrastructure that moves, expands, and cannot be paved over or ignored. The cleanup itself requires immense temporary infrastructure, massive pumps to halt the plume spread, temporary roads laid for hauling contaminated soil, and a new generation of processing plants designed solely to solidify and vitrify the old waste into glass blocks. This cleanup infrastructure is the ultimate acknowledgement of the previous era's failure, infrastructure built to neutralize infrastructure. The workers who built the processing canyons in the 1940s operated on a massive, isolated network of temporary roads and rail spurs. Today, those same roads are the patrol routes of the cleanup crew, the only permanent traffic being the vehicles whose sole purpose is to monitor the ghost they created. The defining legacy. The nuclear bones of America represent the final, most enduring infrastructure ghost. Unlike a railroad that fades into nature, these sites are actively resisting decay, aggressively managed to ensure their silence. They are the paradox of American progress, the ultimate technological achievement that requires the ultimate commitment to non-use. They embody a failure of forecasting, the inability to predict the sheer volume and permanence of the toxic byproduct of national defense and energy production. Elias stood on the edge of the Plutonium Canyon, looking at the silent, vast expanse of capped earth. He considered the long lines of chain-link fence, the subtle hum of the air monitoring stations, and the absolute silence of the enormous landscape. Every piece of infrastructure is a conversation between past, present, and future, Elias wrote. The canal said, "We need to move things today." The dam said, "We will trade your past for our electricity." But the nuclear bones say only one thing, whispered across 10,000 years. We failed to solve this, and now this ghost, this permanent burden, belongs to you. The infrastructure ghosts of the nuclear age are the only ones guaranteed to outlast the memory of the civilization that created them, a testament to an audacious century that secured its present by mortgaging its future to the atom. Chapter 11. The human cost of progress, labor, loss, and the scars left behind. Every ghost road, every dry canal, every silent bridge, and every radioactive burial site is marked not just by concrete and steel, but by an unseen layer of human toil and sacrifice. The physical infrastructure, the engineering triumph or failure, is only half the story. The other half is the human cost, the labor, the loss, and the permanent scars left behind on the families and communities who built America. Dr. Elias Thorne argued that the true measure of a nation's infrastructure is not its longevity, but the ethical price paid for its creation. In his final chapter, he turned his focus from the structures themselves to the invisible, enduring scars of labor, the human ghosts who haunt the progress they helped create. The bodies in the embankment, the canal men. The first great national infrastructure projects, the canals and the early railways,
were constructed with minimal technology and maximal human force. This labor was often coerced, exploited, or imported under conditions of desperation. The cost was measured in lives lost to disease, violence, and primitive worksite accidents. Elias focused on the Erie Extension Canal, a composite of various 19th-century canal projects, where the construction was famously lethal. The work was done by waves of immigrant labor, predominantly Irish, who lived in tent camps along the swampy rights-of-way. The greatest killer was not falling rock or collapsing trenches, but malaria and cholera, diseases that flourished in the hastily dug, stagnant ditches. The work often proceeded in 3 shifts, 7 days a week, with laborers earning a pittance and dying in anonymity. Elias visited a historical site along a preserved section of the old canal, where a local historical society had dedicated a small, unassuming marker. The marker detailed the 1,500 recorded deaths during the 10-year construction period, but local lore suggested the number was far higher, with many men simply vanishing. The ghost road here is the forgotten grave. The men who died were frequently buried in unmarked plots along the canal's embankment, sometimes simply interred in the earth they had just dug. Every rise of the canal bank, every slight swell in the terrain is potentially a collective grave. Elias met with an elderly descendant of one of the original Irish laborers, who recounted a family story. "My great-great-grandfather didn't just dig the canal, he is the canal. He was buried where he fell, and they just kept working around him. When you stand on that bank, you're standing on him." The scar left behind is the economic exploitation woven into the very fabric of the nation. These laborers were expendable, and the speed of progress was deemed more important than their lives. The enduring human cost of the canals is the silence of the thousands of men whose only monument is the still, green water flowing over their remains. The dam builders, sandhogs, and sacrifice. The great hydroelectric dams of the mid-20th century, monuments to the power of the federal government, required an entirely different kind of sacrifice, highly technical, highly dangerous labor in unprecedented conditions. The construction of the massive concrete dams necessitated deep underwater work, high-altitude structural ironwork, and the constant threat of immense, unstable loads. Elias studied the records of the Boulder Dam project, representing Hoover Dam and other major projects, and the construction culture of the 1930s. The most lethal work was often done by the sandhogs, the miners and structural workers who toiled in the deep, narrow diversion tunnels and on the intake towers. The key infrastructure ghost of the dam builders is the tunnel lung. Hundreds of workers developed debilitating and fatal respiratory illnesses from working in the unventilated tunnels, inhaling silica dust from the drilling and concrete mixing. While a few famous, dramatic deaths are often recorded, like the man whose body was allegedly encased in the concrete, the majority died slowly, months or years after the project was complete, far from the celebratory opening ceremonies. Elias visited the site of a memorial dedicated to the workers, a simple wall listing the names of the 96 recorded fatalities, but he noted the epidemiological studies that showed hundreds more died of respiratory failure in the following decade, deaths that were never officially attributed to the dam project. The scar here is the institutional evasion of responsibility. The structures were state-of-the-art, the labor laws and safety standards were primitive. The sheer scale of the dams was paid for by men who exchanged their long-term health for short-term wages during the Great Depression. The completed dam stands as a beacon of clean energy, but its shadow conceals the thousands of lungs that failed to support the effort. The nuclear cleanup, invisible illness. The construction of the early nuclear infrastructure, the processing canyons and research reactors, was fraught with risk. But the lingering human cost comes from the decommissioning and cleanup effort that has spanned the last 3 decades. This is the new ghost labor, dealing with not falling beams or poor ventilation, but with unseen, silent dangers.
This labor force, often highly trained and deeply dedicated, faces the daily reality of radiation exposure and contamination. They wear multi-layered protective suits, a ghost infrastructure of protection itself, and their every movement is monitored by dosilators. The cost of progress here is the constant low-grade psychological toll of knowing that the enemy is invisible, odorless, and may not manifest its damage for 20 years. The true scar is the generational debt. The children and grandchildren of the original construction crews are often the ones now employed in the cleanup, risking their own health to correct the mistakes of their forebears. The infrastructure of cleanup is a permanent job, creating a perpetual cast of workers tied to the ghost site by geography and necessity. Elias interviewed a former cleanup technician, now retired, who described the unique infrastructure of fear. We didn't worry about the big bangs. We worried about the invisible specks of dust. A tiny little flake of plutonium, the size of a grain of salt, inhaled, that's your death sentence. The whole site is haunted by tiny, lethal ghosts that float in the air. The human ghost of the nuclear age is the worker who lives under the sword of Damocles, aware that the progress they enable is inextricably linked to their potential demise. The scarred communities, eminent domain, and displacement. Beyond the individual deaths and illnesses, infrastructure projects often leave behind a collective scar, the permanent displacement of communities. This human cost is often buried beneath the logic of greatest good for the greatest number. Elias documented the construction of the interstate highway system, which required the demolition of thousands of homes and businesses, often slicing directly through vibrant urban and rural neighborhoods. This was particularly devastating to low-income minority communities who lacked the political power to resist eminent domain. He detailed the fate of Old Seneca, a fictionalized neighborhood representing the thousands of urban cores destroyed by the construction of major throughways, like those that cut through cities like Detroit, Baltimore, or New Orleans. Old Seneca was a tight-knit, multi-ethnic neighborhood with strong local businesses and churches. In 1968, the proposed route for the new 6-lane Interstate 57 was stamped directly over its center. Despite protests, the community was razed in 1970. Homes were bought for fractions of their value, and the residents were scattered across the city. The result was a permanent severance of social infrastructure. The scar here is the permanent loss of social capital. What replaced the homes and the churches? A massive concrete trench or an elevated slab of highway deck. The ghost road is the missing street grid, the lanes and alleys that once existed, now replaced by roaring traffic and shadow cast by the concrete. Elias found that decades later, the descendants of the displaced still referred to the ghost streets that run beneath the highway deck. They still use the old street names when giving directions. The memory of the community lives as a ghost infrastructure beneath the official map. The highway, built to connect the region, simultaneously created a deep and permanent disconnect within the city it bisected. The enduring echoes. Elias Thorne concluded his work with a plea for ethical memory. The infrastructure ghosts of America are not just failures of engineering or finance. They are moral failings. They represent the places where the national ambition outran its compassion, and where the promise of progress was paid for by the lives of the most vulnerable. When we drive across a 6-lane bridge, we see only the steel and the water. We never see the man who slipped the cable, the miner who inhaled the dust, or the family who lost their home beneath the abutment. But they are there. They are the true permanent residents of the ghost road. The effort to preserve the memory of the human cost, to place the labor and the loss back into the equation of progress, is the last, most crucial act of infrastructure maintenance. It is an acknowledgement that the American landscape is not merely paved, dammed, and bridged, but profoundly scarred. And until those scars are acknowledged, the ghosts will continue their long walk across the abandoned spans, the dry canals, and the silent, deep tunnels.
Chapter 12. The Engineer's Lament. Why Good Ideas Die in Red Tape. The previous chapters explored the ghosts of structures that were built: dams, canals, railroads, and nuclear sites. But there is a parallel, more frustrating realm of infrastructure ghosts: the projects that were never built. These are the good ideas, often elegant and sometimes revolutionary, that died on the drafting table, smothered by decades of regulatory friction, political maneuvering, community resistance, and the crushing weight of institutional inertia. This is the engineer's lament, the frustration of watching a necessary, feasible, and brilliant solution dissolve into a morass of red tape. Dr. Elias Thorne argued that this bureaucratic decay is the true defining ghost of modern American infrastructure. The physical decay of a bridge can be fixed with concrete and steel. The decay of the institutional ability to build is a far harder problem. Part 1. The Ghost of Efficient Transport, the North Coast Rail Line. The most visible ghosts of bureaucratic failure are ambitious projects aimed at modernizing American transit, particularly high-speed rail. These plans often look perfect on paper, solving problems of congestion and emissions, only to fail in the field due where competing interests and environmental law create a lethal drag. Dr. Elias studied the fictionalized North Coast Rail Line, NCRL, a proposed high-speed corridor designed to connect major metropolitan hubs along a critical region, saving passengers 70% of the travel time compared to existing routes. The project was technically feasible, financially sound, and environmentally superior to adding highway lanes. The NCRL idea was conceived in 1985. The original proposal was a single, comprehensive document detailing the route, the technology, and the financial model. It was, Elias noted, a beautiful piece of engineering. The ghost road of the NCRL is the permit pile. By 2020, the project had amassed over 50,000 pages of environmental impact statements, right-of-way appraisals, biological surveys, tribal consultations, zoning variances, and legal filings. The project wasn't stopped by a single political opponent or a funding shortfall. It was slowly poisoned by 1,000 necessary but cumulative administrative tasks. Elias identified the 3 key bureaucratic choke points. 1. The environmental hurdle. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, requires thorough analysis of all potential environmental impacts. While essential, the process became a tool for indefinite delay. Every time a new endangered species was identified along the 400-mile route, the EIS had to be reopened, triggering new studies and public comment periods. Local activist groups opposed to the project for reasons unrelated to the environment, like noise pollution near their homes, leveraged the NEPA process to stall the project for years at a time. The fragmented right-of-way. The route required acquiring land from over 2,000 separate property owners, 5 different tribal nations, 2 military bases, and navigating 3 distinct state governments, each with its own regulatory bodies. Eminent domain proceedings, once a swift tool of federal infrastructure, became bogged down in decades of local court battles. The funding cliff. The project was perpetually funded through short-term congressional appropriations. By the time the environmental and legal hurdles were cleared in one section, the funding for that section had expired, requiring new political advocacy and often forcing the engineers to update the design to meet newer technology standards, thus restarting the permitting process in a vicious cycle. The engineers assigned to the NCRL spent decades refining the initial design. Elias spoke to one engineer who retired having worked on the project since 1990. He said, "We had the plans ready for the groundbreaking ceremony 5 times. 5 times we were told next year. I saw 2 generations of rail technology come and go while the paperwork sat in a filing cabinet." The ghost of the NCRL is a monument to process over product, a beautiful idea entombed in an endless paper trail. Part 2. The Ghost of Resilience, the Tidal Barrier System. In the realm of resilience and protection, many engineers lamented the failure to implement necessary defenses against climate threats. These failures are often ghosts of political short-sightedness and complex overlapping jurisdictions. Elias analyzed the hypothetical case of the Coastal City Tidal Barrier System, CCTBS, a multi-billion-dollar project proposed after a devastating fictional hurricane struck a major metropolitan area. The CCTBS was designed by the Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, to install massive, movable floodgates at the mouth of the city's bay, protecting the entire inner city from storm surges. The CCTBS idea died not in federal offices, but in the fractured local governance. The area covered by the CCTBS involved 5 separate counties, 3 port authorities, 2 state-level environmental protection agencies, and a dozen municipal governments, all of whom had veto power or required specific consultation. The economic veto. The port authorities, crucial to the local economy, feared that the construction and permanent presence of the massive barrier gates would impede shipping lanes and negatively impact future expansion. They successfully lobbied for years of redesigns that tripled the cost and complexity of the gates. The environmental transfer. The environmental regulators at the state level opposed the inner-city flooding because it would transfer the storm's energy to surrounding lower-income wetland communities outside the barrier. The debate became a political and ethical quagmire: protect the wealthy core or protect the vulnerable periphery. The project stalled due to the inability to achieve consensus of consequences. The political cycle. The project funding relied on a complicated federal, state, and local cost-sharing agreement. Every time a new mayor or governor was elected in the region, the cost-sharing agreement was immediately scrutinized and renegotiated, causing multi-year pauses in engineering work. The project became a political football, celebrated when running for office and deferred once the politician was elected.
The ghost infrastructure here is the deferred defense. The engineers know the solution is necessary and feasible, but the political system is structurally incapable of delivering long-term, expensive projects that span multiple political cycles. The result is that the city remains vulnerable, waiting for the next hurricane to restart the conversation, only for the same bureaucratic ghosts to rise again. Part 3. The Scarred Engineer, the Culture of Blame. The most insidious ghost of the engineer's lament is the cultural environment that punishes proactive solutions and prioritizes adherence to procedure above all else. This culture, Elias argued, leads to risk aversion and the death of true innovation. Elias spoke with several senior engineers who had worked in government roles, managing large-scale infrastructure projects. They described a system where the punishment for a procedural error was far greater than the punishment for institutional delay. The safest thing you can do, one engineer explained, is to study the problem for 2 extra years. If you take 2 extra years, the public forgets, the funding gets reallocated, and your neck is safe. If you rush and break ground and you hit one unexpected pipe, you'll be on the front page and your career is over. This mindset creates the ghost of innovation paralysis. Projects that are truly novel, like integrating decentralized energy grids, implementing Hyperloop technology, or developing next-generation water recycling plants, are inherently riskier in the permitting phase because there is no prior regulatory framework. The result is that the U.S. system tends to favor maintenance over modernization. It is easier and safer to fix an old road in the same way it was fixed 50 years ago than to introduce a new, more durable material or a smarter traffic control system that requires new testing and certification. The final bureaucratic scar is the erosion of trust. When brilliant engineers see their best work, like the NCRL or the CCTBS, die a slow death in a mountain of paperwork, the most capable talent leaves the public sector for private industry, where the scale of work is smaller, but the pace of execution is faster. The engineer's lament, therefore, is not just a story of paperwork, it is a story of national self-sabotage. America possesses the technical ingenuity, the raw materials, and the need to build the next generation of infrastructure, but it has created an intricate, self-defeating administrative infrastructure that acts as a permanent brake on progress. The ghost road that never gets built is the heaviest burden of all, for it is the one that prevents the solution to the problems of tomorrow.
Chapter 13. Reclaiming the Ruins. Infrastructure as Post-Industrial Art. Dr. Elias Thorne always emphasized that the life cycle of infrastructure was cyclical: utility, decay, and then replacement. But in America's post-industrial landscape, a fourth stage had emerged: reclamation. This chapter is dedicated to the infrastructure ghosts that refuse to stay dead. They are the skeletal remains of industry, the defunct railways, the abandoned concrete silos, the massive empty power plants that are being aggressively and beautifully repurposed. This is where the pragmatic world of engineering meets the abstract world of art, creating structures that serve an entirely new, often purely cultural or ecological, function. The subtitle, Infrastructure as Post-Industrial Art, is not just a poetic metaphor, it is an economic and architectural movement centered on adaptive reuse. The structure's utility may be gone, but its form, its sheer monumental presence becomes the raw material for a new kind of public space. The architect's vision, Sarah Chen and the Sky River. Elias's analysis often turned to the work of people like Sarah Chen, a landscape architect based in the Northeast who became the unofficial champion of American industrial ruins. Sarah saw concrete and rusted steel not as blight, but as a pre-built canvas, monuments to a powerful past waiting for a creative resurrection. "We spend billions trying to erase the past," Sarah once told a symposium, projecting a stark image of an abandoned elevated rail line draped in ivy. But what if we just acknowledged its power? The Romans didn't tear down the temples of the cultures they conquered, they simply turned them into churches. The structure remains, but the spirit changes. That's what we do with infrastructure. Sarah's most famous hypothetical project, which Elias often cited, was the Sky River, a vision for converting an unused elevated goods rail loop in a major Rust Belt city. It had been built in the 1920s to bypass dense downtown traffic, carrying coal and manufactured goods directly to river barges. It sat 30 feet in the air, a mile-long concrete scar looping over residential neighborhoods. The local government wanted to spend $150 million to demolish it. Sarah proposed spending $40 million to reclaim it. Case Study 1. The Elevated Rail Ghost. The Sky River concept directly addressed the ghost of the elevated rail, the long, linear, and often dividing scar across the urban fabric. The problem of the ruin: elevated rail lines, when abandoned, create darkness and blight below, contributing to urban decay. They're often structurally sound, but administratively orphaned. The reclamation: Sarah's team proposed a multi-layered reclamation. 1. Structural stabilization and sealing. Basic structural repairs to ensure safety, primarily sealing the concrete to prevent further spalling and rust bleed. the raw, weathered look of the concrete would be preserved. 2. Ecological layering. The river. Instead of removing the crushed stone ballast, they would clean it, stabilize it with geotextiles, and introduce a deep planting medium. The entire loop would become a continuous ecological corridor, the river. It wouldn't carry water, but it would carry life. Native grasses, pollinator gardens, and small groves of drought-resistant trees. This green strip would act as a natural sponge, absorbing stormwater runoff that had previously flooded the streets below. 3. The art layer. A simple poured aggregate path would weave through the plantings, providing public access. Crucially, the path would be dotted with the ghosts of function, repurposed remnants of the rail line itself. Old steel support struts would be turned into benches. Derelict signaling boxes would be cleaned and converted into small weatherproof libraries or birdwatching stations. The tracks themselves would be left in place in certain sections, integrated into the design as boundary markers or historical art pieces. 4. The light layer. The underside of the elevated structure, previously a dark, intimidating space, would be fitted with subtle, motion-activated LED lighting that changed colors slowly throughout the day, transforming the support columns into columns of shifting light. This addressed the safety issue without concealing the brutalist beauty of the columns. The Sky River project exemplified the dual purpose of post-industrial art. It solves a practical urban problem, blight, runoff, while creating a profoundly meaningful public space. It honors the industrial past without being beholden to it. It transformed a ghost of transportation into a spirit of respite. Part 2. The concrete titans, silos, and power plants. Not all ghost infrastructure is linear. Some of the most powerful and brutal architectural ghosts are the massive, monolithic structures, the concrete grain silos, the cooling towers of decommissioned power plants, and the immense turbine halls of defunct factories. These were designed purely for utility, resulting in forms of sublime, unintentional art. Case Study 3. The Vertical Museum, Grain Silos. Elias explored the trend of reclaiming gargantuan grain silos, often found near river terminals or old rail yards. These cylindrical concrete stacks, sometimes standing 150 feet high, represent peak industrial efficiency. The problem of the ruin? Silos are structurally impenetrable, offering few windows or access points, making traditional residential or office conversion extremely difficult and expensive. The reclamation? In several cities, these silos have been embraced for their unique spatial qualities. 1. The climbing wall gym. Due to the height and lack of interior partitions, some silos have been converted into the world's most unique indoor climbing gyms. The interior walls become colossal, curving climbing surfaces, making the entire structure an engine for recreation. 2. The vertical farm. The internal, protected environment of the silo is ideal for hydroponic and aeroponic vertical farming. The structure is retrofitted with automated LED light racks, water recycling systems, and climate control, producing fresh greens for the local community. A rebirth of industrial production, but for food, not goods. 3. The Museum of Scale. The most artistic approach is epitomized by a few projects that turned the silo complex into an art museum. The thick concrete walls offer a perfect environment for controlled temperature and lighting. The large cylindrical spaces, the bunkers, are used for displaying massive, site-specific sculptures and installations. The monumental scale of the architecture becomes part of the art itself, forcing the viewer to confront the sheer size of the industrial age. The ghost of the silo is the ghost of volume, a concrete shell of immense capacity, now filled with either food, art, or human ambition. Case Study 4. The Cathedral of Power. Decommissioned coal and gas power plants, with their gigantic cooling towers and cavernous turbine halls, pose the ultimate reclamation challenge. The turbine halls, often designed with the functional grandeur of a European train station, are increasingly becoming industrial cathedrals. Sarah Chen's team worked on concepts to preserve one such hall, turning it into a multi-use performance space. Instead of gutting the structure, they preserved the gantry cranes and the immense concrete pedestals where the turbines once sat. The space was treated acoustically, but the mechanical aesthetic was celebrated, a dramatic backdrop for concerts, theatrical performances, and large-scale public markets. The cooling towers, often slated for implosion, were reimagined as biodomes. The vast open cones could be repurposed as sheltered microclimate zones, either inverted vertical gardens or research centers focusing on sustainable architecture shielded from the external climate. Their ghostly, vaporous past is transformed into a nurturing, closed ecosystem.
Part 3. The Ecological Ghost: Canals and Water Systems. The reclamation movement also addresses the buried and forgotten infrastructure of water management, the abandoned canals, the concrete culverts that replace natural streams, and the relics of water treatment facilities. Elias saw these as the ecological ghosts, the infrastructure where the fight for reuse becomes a fight for environmental correction. The daylighting movement. In many older American cities, natural streams were encased in concrete pipes and buried underground to facilitate urban development and sewage management a century ago. These are the urban waterways that became subterranean ghosts. The daylighting movement involves literally breaking open the concrete and allowing the stream to flow naturally to the surface again. While technically complicated, requiring extensive work to separate storm water from sewage and reroute utilities, the result is transformative. 1. Ecological function. It restores a vital habitat corridor for fish, birds, and insects. 2. Public amenity. The newly restored stream becomes the centerpiece of a linear park, dramatically increasing local property values and quality of life. 3. Stormwater management. The natural riverbed, with its vegetation and soil, is vastly superior to a concrete pipe at absorbing and filtering rainwater, reducing flood risk. The act of daylighting is an architectural apology, a reversal of the 20th century mindset that prioritized utility over nature. It demonstrates that the most meaningful reclamation can involve removing infrastructure to reveal the natural structure beneath. The filtration art of the treatment plant. Abandoned water and sewage treatment plants, with their vast empty concrete settling tanks, represent a powerful opportunity for ecological art. These sites are often massive, secured, and located near water bodies. Instead of demolition, some architects propose turning these tanks into natural filtration gardens. The tanks are filled with layers of gravel, sand, and bioremediation plants like reeds and rushes. The area becomes a massive, passive filtration system for urban runoff, slowly cleansing the water before it re-enters the river or lake. The plant's former function, cleaning water through chemistry, is replaced by its new function, cleaning water through ecology. The rusting pipes and valves become visual elements, sculptural reminders of the industrial past, while the tanks themselves bloom with life. Part 4. Dr. Thorne's Synthesis: A Nation Reborn. Elias Thorne concluded his study of post-industrial art with a profound realization about the American spirit. We are a nation obsessed with newness. We build the biggest, the fastest, the shiniest, and when the utility expires, we are culturally programmed to tear it down and start over. This constant cycle of wholesale replacement is expensive, wasteful, and psychologically isolating. It cuts us off from our own history. The movement of post-industrial art, led by architects and artists like Sarah Chen, offers a necessary counter-narrative. The infrastructure of the future must be built from the infrastructure of the past. 1. The economic argument. It is almost always cheaper to adapt a solid concrete structure than to demolish it and build a new foundation. The embodied energy.
The energy and carbon already invested in creating the steel and concrete is too vast to simply discard. Reclamation is the ultimate act of recycling. 2. The human argument. These reclaimed ruins create a richer urban environment. They serve as physical reminders of a community's labor, industry, and transformation. A park built on an old rail line connects the community to the past in a way that a generic new park cannot. The tension between the raw, brutalist concrete and the soft, organic plant life creates a unique sense of place. 3. The legal political pivot. The process of adaptive reuse is often simpler than new construction. Because the land is already zoned industrially or publicly and the structure is already present, the complex environmental impact statements, NEPA, and zoning battles that plague new infrastructure, as detailed in the previous chapter, can often be streamlined or even avoided. It's an end run around the red tape. Sarah's final reflection. Back on the Sky River project, which was now moving through the funding stages due to its popularity and lower cost, Sarah Chen stood atop the old concrete viaduct one evening, watching the sunset paint the underside of the girders orange. The work was painstaking. Every section of concrete had to be analyzed. Every railing had to be fabricated to modern safety standards while retaining an industrial look, and every planting choice had to be approved by multiple ecological groups. But it was building. It was creating. She looked down at the preserved tracks, now partially covered by low-growing sedum plants, and saw not just a walkway, but a bridge between eras. The ghost of the freight train, the relentless movement of industry was finally being laid to rest, but its spirit, its immovable form, was being reborn as a space for human movement, for quiet contemplation, and for nature's determined return. The engineer's lament of the previous generation, the frustration of seeing good ideas die, was being replaced by the architect's joy, the sheer visceral satisfaction of coaxing new life from the magnificent bones of the past. The ruins were not monuments to failure. They were found objects waiting to be redefined, the ultimate canvases for the next chapter of American urban art.
Chapter 14. The Next Ghost Road. Predictions for the Coming Century. The transition from the 20th to the 21st century marks a fundamental shift in the nature of American infrastructure. For 200 years, decay followed failure. The bridge rusted, the road cracked, the utility failed, and then the government reacted. But Dr. Elias Thorne, having documented the haunting beauty of historical ruins, turned his focus to the future, to the infrastructure currently being built, maintained, or relied upon that is structurally sound but functionally doomed. The next ghost roads will not be abandoned due to neglect, but due to evolution, policy, and ecological necessity. The primary prediction for the coming century is clear. Obsolescence will precede decay. We will preemptively retire vast national networks not because they are broken, but because they are wrong. Part 1. The Ghost of Carbon, the Great Decommissioning. The most monumental infrastructure ghost currently being constructed, or at least currently being maintained with trillions of dollars, is the fossil fuel ecosystem. This includes pipelines, natural gas compression stations, sprawling coal terminals, and oil refineries. Over the next 50 years, as the nation moves toward decarbonization, these assets are set to become the stranded giants of the 21st century. The pipeline dilemma: burial or resurrection. Pipelines are the vascular system of the current American economy, stretching hundreds of thousands of miles beneath the surface. They represent a massive, linear, and often invisible infrastructure that will soon lose its utility. The problem isn't just turning off the flow, it's what to do with the pipe itself. The functional death. As electric vehicle or EV adoption approaches 80% and renewable energy penetrates the grid, the demand for gasoline and natural gas will plummet. the vast capacity of current pipelines will become economically indefensible. They will cease to be profitable long before they cease to be structurally sound. The ghostly afterlife. The decommissioning of this infrastructure presents an environmental and engineering nightmare. 1. The environmental trap. Pipelines cannot simply be left in the ground. Residual hydrocarbons, corrosion inhibitors, and accumulated waste sludge create a massive, ticking environmental hazard. Excavating and removing all pipelines is an undertaking of such scale and cost, estimated in the trillions, that it is politically and practically impossible. 2. The fill and seal method. The current leading prediction involves draining the pipelines completely, flushing them with non-toxic agents, and then filling them with an inert material, often nitrogen gas or a highly specialized grout, before permanently sealing the ends. This process, repeated thousands of times across the country, will create a massive subterranean network of inert, pressurized metal tubes, a permanent ghost road running beneath rivers, farms, and cities. The ghost of carbon will be a vast, invisible network of buried metal, a silent monument to the energy source that defined the American 20th century. The power plant cathedrals. Beyond the pipes, the massive centralized fossil fuel power plants, the cathedrals of power Elias discussed in the previous chapter, are fading. While some will be beautifully repurposed, the sheer volume of concrete and steel being decommissioned is staggering. The future grid is decentralized and distributed. Solar arrays, battery storage, offshore wind farms, rendering the concept of a singular, enormous coal or gas-burning facility obsolete. The ghost here is concentrated scale. The expense of environmental remediation on these sites is so high that many will become state-owned Superfund sites, fenced off and perpetually monitored, becoming literal no-go zones, the most powerful and untouchable ghosts of the American landscape. Part 2. The Ghost of Bandwidth, the Wireless Graveyard. If the 20th century was defined by physical flow, oil, goods, water, the 21st century is defined by data flow. Yet data infrastructure is subject to one of the fastest rates of obsolescence. The fiber optic failure. In the 1990s and early 2000s, hundreds of millions of miles of copper and then fiber optic cable were laid, representing a monumental investment in linear, physical infrastructure. But the technological curve is steep and unforgiving. The functional death. Terrestrial fiber faces two existential threats. 1. Satellite revolution. The rise of low Earth orbit satellite constellations like Starlink is rapidly challenging the necessity of last-mile fiber delivery, especially in rural and low-density areas. Why pay for trenching and maintenance when near gigabit speeds can be beamed directly to a small dish? 2. Quantum and beyond. For truly long-haul, high-volume data transmission, new technologies like quantum communication networks or specialized atmospheric transmission will render current silica-based fiber obsolete long before it fails physically. The ghost afterlife. Fiber optic cables, like pipelines, are a ghost road that cannot be feasibly removed. They are often buried directly into the ground or attached to utility poles. Rural decay. Thousands of miles of fiber laid in rural areas that become economically non-viable will simply be abandoned in place. The plastic casing will degrade, the glass threads will sit inertly in the soil, and the thousands of junction boxes, small green concrete bunkers dotting the countryside, will be left to rust. The digital debris. While non-toxic, this creates a vast, sprawling network of digital debris. A constant, unseen reminder of a communication technology that briefly served its purpose before being surpassed by the speed of light and the economics of space. The ghost of bandwidth is the only ghost road that can span the entire globe and weigh next to nothing. The cell tower skeletons. The massive steel cell towers that currently dominate the skyline are also facing eventual obsolescence. As networks shift from 5G to 6G and 7G and beyond, the architecture of radio transmission changes. We are moving from large, powerful, centralized towers that cover miles to small, highly localized, low-power small cells integrated into streetlights, buildings, and public transport infrastructure. The hundreds of thousands of colossal lattice towers, many of which are now functionally redundant, will become the vertical skeletons of the communication age. They are difficult and expensive to dismantle, leading to protracted legal and environmental battles over who is responsible for removing the 300-foot-tall steel ghosts from the landscape.
Part 3. The Ghost of Control. The Automated Asphalt. The largest, most expensive, and most culturally defining piece of American infrastructure is the 4.1 million miles of public roads and the approximately 48,000 miles of the interstate highway system. This is the ultimate ghost road of the future because it was built for an obsolete driver, the human being. The obsolescence of the highway grid. The entire design lexicon of the American highway, lane markings, signage, banked curves, speed limits, and complex interchanges is dedicated to mitigating human error and physiological limits. With the widespread adoption of Level 5 full autonomous vehicles, AVs, this control infrastructure instantly becomes a ghost. The functional death. Once AVs dominate the road, the need for wide lanes, huge shoulders, crash barriers, and most notably, signage vanishes. Why warn a computer about a tight curve when it calculates the optimal velocity in milliseconds? Quote, "Signage ghosts. The vast aluminum forests of signs and overhead gantries, speed limits, exit signs, warnings will become functionally useless. They are expensive to maintain, pollute the skyline, and will serve only as visual clutter for the computer vision systems of AVs. They will be slowly removed, leaving behind only the concrete footings, the markers of a time when we needed words to tell us where to go." Quote, "Lane ghosts. The entire geometry of traffic flow, optimized for human reaction time and limited capacity, becomes obsolete. AVs can drive closer together, travel at higher speeds, and navigate without the complex, multi-lane dances of human merging." Quote, "The dedicated autonomous corridor. Elias Thorne predicted a dual system would emerge. 1. The legacy roads, the ghost road. The vast majority of secondary roads and local streets will remain open but will become the slow network, the low-speed domain of human drivers, recreation, and last-mile delivery. Maintenance will drop significantly, and they will slowly revert to cracked, overgrown relics. 2. The autonomous corridors, the new road. A critical subset of the interstate system, perhaps 10,000 miles, will be entirely repurposed. These lanes will be equipped with dedicated power, embedded sensors, and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. Human drivers will be strictly forbidden. These corridors will be narrower, eliminating the need for current safety margins and optimized for relentless, high-speed, high-density autonomous transit. The original interstate, a symbol of American freedom and personal control, will become a massive, silent, largely unused infrastructure ghost, relegated to historical status, while the future of mobility races alongside it in a tightly controlled, digitized lane. Part 4. The Ghost of Water Security. The Climate Crucible. In the next century, climate change is set to break certain types of infrastructure that were built with 20th century assumptions about weather and water cycles. These ghosts will appear not through obsolescence, but through overwhelming force. The coastal walls. Coastal infrastructure, seawalls, floodgates, and port facilities is currently battling sea level rise and increasing storm intensity.
These structures were built to withstand a 50-year storm, not a 10-year storm. The coming ghost road in coastal areas will be the permanent sandbag line. As massive concrete walls and barriers fail or are overwhelmed, the scale of replacement required will be economically paralyzing. The new infrastructure will be temporary and fluid, mobile deployable flood barriers, engineered wetlands that replace hard walls, and most critically, massive planned retreat infrastructure to move entire sections of coastal development inland. The ghost here is the ghost of the coastline, the infrastructure we build right up to the edge of the water, which climate change will inevitably force us to abandon. The mega pipeline infrastructure. Paradoxically, while some pipelines will become ghosts, others will be built at a colossal scale to deal with water scarcity. The Great Ghost Road of the American West will be the aging infrastructure of the Colorado River and Hoover Dam, which are rapidly failing to meet demand. The solution, Elias argued, will be immense water relocation infrastructure. 1. Desalination plants. New, massive, and highly power-intensive desalination plants along the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico. 2. The mega conduit. The ghost roads of the West will be replaced by new water mega pipelines built to move desalinated or recycled water hundreds of miles inland, an unprecedented, politically charged, and environmentally complex undertaking. These new water pipelines will be the most crucial and likely the most vulnerable infrastructure built in the second half of the 21st century. Dr. Thorne's prophecy. Designing for the end. Dr. Elias Thorne work on future ghost roads led him to one inescapable conclusion. We must fundamentally change the way we approach infrastructure planning. Quote, "The engineering principle of the last century was permanency, to build something that lasts forever. The reality of the next century is rapid evolution. We must adopt the principle of intentional obsolescence." Intentional obsolescence dictates that every major infrastructure project, from a solar farm to a high-speed rail line, must be designed with its planned end of life baked into the initial blueprints. Quote, "Materiality. Use materials that are easily separable, recoverable, and non-toxic when buried. Avoid materials that require prohibitively expensive environmental remediation." Quote, "Accessibility. Design large structures like turbine bases or bridge footings for eventual re-entry and removal, not just burial." Quote, "Funding. A percentage of the original project cost must be legally locked into an independent trust fund, dedicated solely to the eventual safe decommissioning of the asset 75 years later. This removes the who pays for removal political ghost that currently haunts all our aging infrastructure. The ultimate tragedy of the 20th century was building infrastructure that our grandchildren couldn't afford to tear down. The salvation of the 21st century lies in designing infrastructure that will quietly and affordably put itself to rest, paving the way for the next necessary evolution. The next ghost road will not be a haunting scar. It will be a cleanly swept path toward a new future.
Chapter 15. Echoes of the Builders. How the Forgotten Structures Still Shape America. Dr. Elias Thorne always insisted that the past was not just a collection of dates and names, but a material reality that continues to exert force upon the present. We walk on it, drive over it, and draw energy through its hidden veins every single day. The true ghost roads are not merely abandoned, but are the deeply embedded foundations, the colossal overlooked efforts of previous generations whose structural choices, limitations, and even mistakes dictate the geometry of modern American life. This chapter is an exploration of that pervasive influence, focusing on how three forgotten structures, the original municipal power grid, the transcontinental railway system's right-of-way, and the foundational material of concrete still govern our geography, economy, and politics. Part 1. The Grid's Genealogy, the Burden of Edison and Westinghouse. The way modern America receives its power is not a result of a 21st century master plan. It is a direct function of decisions made in the 1990s regarding wire gauge, voltage, and corporate competition. The electricity we rely on today is the echo of the builders at its most literal and pervasive. The tyranny of the pole and the wire. Walk down almost any street outside of the densest urban cores, and the infrastructure of the late 19th and early 20th century is manifest: the utility pole. It is an artifact of the War of the Currents, the era when Thomas Edison's direct current, or DC, lost to Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse's alternating current, or AC. AC won because it could transmit power efficiently over longer distances. The immediate result was the creation of a vast, decentralized aerial network, the wooden utility pole. 1. The geographic constraint. The placement of these poles, often along property lines or inherited dirt tracks, established the path for virtually all subsequent linear infrastructure. When telephone lines and later fiber optic cables were installed, they piggybacked on the existing utility pole easements. The digital world's nervous system, therefore, runs along the same erratic, winding paths dictated by the lowest cost, easiest to install power lines of 120 years ago. 2. The maintenance debt. The U.S. currently maintains an estimated 160 million wooden utility poles. These structures have an inherent lifespan of 50 to 70 years. Every major storm, every wildfire, every truck accident is an expensive and time-consuming problem because the builders chose wood and air rather than concrete and underground trenches. This ghost structure is not decaying due to neglect, but is a perpetual source of disaster liability and maintenance costs, a constant tax on the modern economy mandated by a century-old choice. 3. The resistance to change. The grid is now struggling to integrate decentralized renewable energy, solar, wind. The ghost here is the centralized architecture. The original builders focused on massive power plants feeding outward. This architecture makes it complex and expensive to accommodate two-way power flow from millions of home solar panels. The modern energy transition is being physically constrained by the historical wiring diagram of the early 20th century utilities. Part 2. The geometry of steel, the infallible railway right-of-way. The interstate highway system is often cited as the great shaper of modern America, but the true, lasting skeleton of the nation was cast decades earlier, the railway network built between the 1850s and 1920s. The immutable line. When railroad companies acquired land grants or purchased easements, they established the right-of-way, a physical corridor of land often 100 to 200 feet wide that cannot be easily moved or extinguished. 1. The ghost of the grade. Railroads, unlike roads, require a minimal grade to function efficiently. To achieve this, engineers undertook monumental earth-moving projects, cutting through mountains, filling valleys, and raising embankments. These cuts and fills, which run for thousands of miles, are permanent alterations to the American landscape. They serve as impermeable barriers to urban development and hydrological flow. Even where the tracks have been pulled up, the deep cuts and high embankments remain, immutable, silent ghosts determining where a new road must curve or where a housing development cannot expand. 2. The utility corridor. The railway ROW proved to be the single most important piece of forgotten infrastructure. It offered a straight, clear, and legally established path across vast territories. When intercontinental telecommunications began in the mid-20th century, where did they bury their cables? Along the railway ROW. When long-distance oil and gas pipelines were built, along the railway ROW. When the internet required high-capacity fiber optic trunk lines, along the railway ROW. The ghost of the railway is the linear logic that defines the paths of virtually all critical modern infrastructure. The fiber backbone of the internet does not follow the shortest distance between 2 points. It follows the path of a steam engine from 1885. This inherited geometry is why certain regions have high-speed access and others do not. A digital age echo of 19th century land speculation and engineering. The ghost towns of commerce. The location of America's major cities, and crucially its forgotten towns, is an echo of the railway builders' decisions. Every town created during the expansion era was placed exactly 1 day's horse ride or later 1 train stop apart. As the economy centralized, many of these small towns withered, becoming the literal ghost towns of the West. But they leave an economic echo. The modern trucking logistics network is forced to service these dispersed, historically relevant settlements, often making delivery routes inefficient and costly. The tax base and political boundaries of counties and states remain tied to the historical density dictated by the railway's presence, creating persistent pockets of economic disparity. The ghost of economic geography. Part 3. The ghost of strength. The cracking concrete. Perhaps the most significant and structurally problematic ghost of American infrastructure is the ubiquitous foundational material, concrete. The steel skeleton and the concrete cancer. The great building boom of the mid-20th century, which gave us the interstate, countless municipal bridges, dams, and multi-story parking garages, relied overwhelmingly on steel-reinforced concrete. The builders of that era prized concrete's compressive strength and the speed with which it could be poured. They intended for these structures to last 75 to 100 years. However, the chemical and physical limitations of this ghost structure are now creating a national crisis. Concrete cancer. 1. The chemical echo. All modern concrete contains trace amounts of salt and air voids. When the steel rebar inside is exposed to moisture and road salt, the primary de-icing agent used across the North American continent, the steel rusts. Rust expands. This expansion cracks the surrounding concrete, creating more pathways for water, which leads to more rust. This cyclical structural failure is now accelerating across hundreds of thousands of bridges and overpasses built between 1950 and 1970. 2. The cost inheritance. Fixing these structures is exponentially more expensive than maintaining them, and replacement requires tearing down and rebuilding entire sections of the busiest economic arteries. The ghost here is the cost of durability. The original structures were built quickly and cheaply. The inheritance is a trillion-dollar maintenance debt that America is struggling to pay.
The hydrological burden of concrete. Cities today are struggling with massive, catastrophic flooding events. While climate change exacerbates the problem, the root cause is often the ghost of impermeability, the sheer volume of concrete poured by the mid-century builders. When a natural landscape receives rain, the earth absorbs most of it, slowing the runoff. When a city is covered in concrete roads, sidewalks, and parking lots, all that water is rapidly channeled into an underground network of storm drains. The municipal drainage systems, built in the 1920s to 1960s, were sized to handle the historical average rainfall of their time. They were never designed to handle the rapid runoff from a fully concretized surface combined with the extreme intensity of modern climate-fueled storms. As a result, major American cities are struggling with basement flooding, overflowing sewers, and flash floods that paralyze commerce. The structural decision to prioritize hard, impermeable surfaces a century ago now directly costs lives and billions in economic damage every year. Part 4. The echo in the walls, lead, asbestos, and the public health ghost. Not all ghosts are structural or geographical. Some are toxic and embedded. The forgotten choices in building materials are still shaping the health and social geography of the nation. The ghost of the cheap pipe. The use of lead pipes for water delivery until the 1950s, a choice made due to its cost-effectiveness and ease of bending, created a public health disaster. While thousands of miles have been replaced, the remaining networks, often concentrated in older, lower-income urban centers,
a direct echo of historical redlining practices, continued to poison citizens. The ghost here is toxic legacy. The choice of material over health, an artifact of the pre-environmental regulation era, is the primary driver of political movements and massive infrastructure spending programs today. The past is quite literally leaching into the water supply. The ghost of insulation. Asbestos, prized for its fire retardant and insulating properties, was a foundational building block for schools, hospitals, and homes for nearly a century. Now it sits benignly in millions of walls and ceilings, harmless only as long as it is undisturbed. The functional ghost of asbestos is that it prevents necessary renovation and adaptation. When a school needs a 21st century technological upgrade or a public building needs energy efficiency improvements, the simple act of drilling a hole or opening a wall triggers an expensive and hazardous asbestos abatement procedure. This legacy material actively impedes modernization and reinvestment in older community structures, acting as a financial barrier that keeps the past physically preserved but functionally obsolete. Conclusion. We are all walking on the ghost road. Elias Thorne's work taught him that infrastructure is never truly finished, it simply changes state. The builders of the previous century, the anonymous crews who laid the rails, climbed the poles, and poured the concrete, made decisions that were rational for their time, but have become the intractable limitations of ours. To understand America today, Thorne concluded, you must understand what its foundations prohibit. The hour lines tell us where the internet must run. The railway grades tell us where the river must flow. The type of cement tells us when the bridge must fail. The echo of the builders is the quiet, constant force that ensures progress is never a straight line, but a meandering, expensive, and often painful negotiation with the ghosts of material choices made long ago. The act of modern construction is not creation. It is a difficult, costly process of exorcising and building around the silent, immovable structures of the past that still dictate our every move.